Magnus Vale didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved the door of Blackthorn's main house open, so hard the hinges screamed, and he stood there in the gray morning light with his fur coat and his cold eyes and his lawyer standing 2 steps behind him like a trained dog. Everett Rourke was still in bed, too sick to stand, barely able to speak, and Vale walked right past the doorway into the old man's bedroom, without permission, without hesitation, without a single trace of shame. "Sign it," Vale said. He dropped a document on the blanket covering Everett's chest. Just dropped it there, like it was nothing, like the man beneath it was nothing. "Sign it today or I'll have the bank call your debt by Friday. You'll lose the land either way, Rourke. At least this way you die in a warm room." Everett's hand was shaking. His lips moved, but nothing came out. Vale turned and walked back toward the door, and that's when he saw her, a young woman standing in the kitchen entrance, still holding a pot of broth, staring at him with eyes that didn't flinch. He looked at her the way men like him look at women they've already decided don't matter. "Who are you?" he said. "The cook," Nora Vance answered. Vale almost smiled. "Then stay in the kitchen," he left. The door banged shut behind him, and Nora stood there in the cold with the broth going warm in her hands, listening to Everett try to breathe, thinking about everything she didn't have: no money, no connections, no last name that meant anything in this county, and she made a decision right then that would change the rest of her life. She was not going to let that man win. If this story already has you gripping the edge of your seat, you're exactly where we want you. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and follow Nora's story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what happens next. And while you're at it, tap that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Nora Vance risked, you have to understand what she walked into. The snow started before dawn and didn't stop. By the time Nora Vance had been walking for 2 hours, the trail had disappeared completely under 8 inches of new white, and the wind off the northern flats was the kind of cold that didn't just chill you, it reached inside your chest and squeezed. Her boots were not meant for this. They were town boots, the soles thin, the leather cracked at the left toe where she'd repaired it twice already with thread and beeswax and sheer stubbornness. Her coat had been her mother's. It was wool, good wool but old, and the places where it had worn thin at the shoulders let the cold straight through like she wasn't wearing anything at all. She had 17 cents in her coat pocket, a folded letter in her inside breast pocket, the paper gone soft from being handled too many times, and a name: Blackthorn Ranch. 12 miles from the town of Garnet, according to the man at the feed store, who'd read her the posting out loud because the handwriting was cramped, and she'd asked nicely. Cook and housekeeper wanted. Room and board plus $6 monthly. Apply in person. Nora had applied in person. The problem was that she'd applied 2 days after a blizzard had cut the road, and by the time she'd gotten word that the position was hers, another storm was already building on the horizon. The sensible thing would have been to wait. She knew that. But the rooming house where she'd been sleeping had raised its rates after the first of the year, and the money she had left from her last job washing dishes at a saloon, for a man who paid late and docked her wages for the privilege, wouldn't last another 2 weeks. So she walked. She told herself she wasn't afraid of the cold. That was mostly true. She'd grown up in Usset House on the eastern Montana plain with a father who trapped and a mother who made do, and neither one of them had been the type to coddle. Fear was a thing you acknowledged and then set aside, because you still had to get where you were going regardless. What she was afraid of, though she didn't say it to herself in those exact words, was arriving and finding the position already filled. Or worse, arriving and finding something wrong. Some situation she hadn't anticipated that would make the whole journey useless. She crested a low ridge around mid-morning and saw the ranch below her, and her first thought was that it looked like it had been forgotten about. Not ruined. Not broken down, just left. The way a room looks when nobody has been in it for a season. The fences were intact, but needed mending in 2 or 3 places she could see from the ridge. The barn was solid big, the kind of barn a serious operation puts up, but the doors hadn't been cleared of snow and there were no tracks between it and the main house. The house itself was 2 stories, built from timber and stone, with a wide covered porch and windows that should have had light in them at this hour of the morning. They didn't. Nora stood on the ridge for a moment, with the wind at her back, and looked at the dark windows, and the knot in her stomach tightened. She went down anyway. The porch steps were slick with ice, and she took them carefully, holding the rail. She knocked on the front door. Waited. Knocked again, harder this time. The sound of her knuckles against the wood was very loud in all that silence. Nothing. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked, or maybe the latch had frozen, in a way that made it feel unlocked. She couldn't quite tell, and it opened inward with a groan that sounded like it hurt. She pushed it wider and stepped inside. The cold came with her, because the house wasn't much warmer than outside. That was wrong. It was the middle of January. A house in Montana in January was supposed to have a fire going, was supposed to have the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, was supposed to feel like a shelter. This house felt like an empty box. Hello? Her voice fell flat in the dim interior. The front room was a sitting room with heavy furniture and a stone fireplace that had gone cold. She could see the ash in the grate from across the room. Old ash, nothing recent. There was a lamp on the mantelpiece, but it hadn't been lit. Coats on a row of hooks by the door, boots on the floor beneath them. Nora moved through the sitting room and found the kitchen bigger than she'd expected. A good working kitchen with a cast iron range and a proper pump and shelves of preserves and dry goods along the back wall. The range was cold, too. A pot had been left on the counter with something in it that had gone solid and gray. She didn't investigate that further. She went to the door at the back of the kitchen that she guessed led to the rest of the house, pushed it open, and walked down a short hallway. The first door was closed. She put her ear against it and heard breathing rough, labored, the kind of breathing that has something thick and wrong in it. She opened the door. The man in the bed was old, probably past 60, with a weathered face that would have been hard-looking in health, but was slack now with fever. He was buried under 2 quilts and a horse blanket and still shivering. His lips were dry and cracked. His eyes were half open, but not seeing anything useful. On the small table beside the bed, there was a cup with maybe a finger of water left in it, and a cloth that had dried out completely, which meant nobody had been tending to him for at least several hours. Nora stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, doing the kind of rapid, unglamorous arithmetic that emergencies require. She had arrived at a job that was supposed to be cooking and housekeeping. She had found a man who appeared to be actively dying of fever, with no one to help him. She could leave. She could walk back out through that frozen door and down the road to Garnet and tell herself it wasn't her problem. She hadn't even officially started the job. She had no obligation here. She thought about the 17 cents in her pocket. She thought about the sod house where she'd grown up, and the winter her father had gotten sick, and her mother had sat up 3 nights straight by his side. She went to the kitchen and lit the range. It took her 4 tries to get the kindling to catch. Her hands were still cold from the walk, and the flint was old, but she got it going. While the range was heating, she found the woodpile on the back porch. More wood than she'd expected, enough to last a while, and she hauled in enough to fill the bin beside the range and another armload for the fireplace in the front room. She wasn't strong in the way that men at hard physical labor are strong, but she was capable, which is a different thing and often more useful. She got the front room fire going first, then came back and put a pot of water on the range. Found what she needed in the pantry. There were beef bones in a crock on the lowest shelf, left from some earlier butchering, and she put them on to simmer. Found dried yarrow in a cloth bag hanging from a hook. Someone in this house knew something about medicinal herbs, or had known, and she added a small amount to a separate pot with water and honey. Then she went back to the bedroom and did the immediate work. Wet the cloth, laid it on the man's forehead. Got a few spoonfuls of water between his lips, slowly, making sure he swallowed. Pulled the quilts tighter, checked his hands and feet for the grayish color that meant something worse than fever. His eyes focused on her face, briefly like a lamp flickering. He got that far and stopped. Nora Vance, she said. You hired me to cook. I'm cooking. She wrung out the cloth again, laid it back. Don't try to talk. He closed his eyes. She wasn't sure if that was compliance or unconsciousness, but either way it was fine. Over the next several hours, she built the sickroom routine that her mother had taught her, and that she'd had occasion to use twice before in her 23 years, once for her father, and once for a neighbor woman in the winter of '83. Broth every hour when he was conscious enough to take it. Yarrow tea when his temperature spiked. Cool cloth on his forehead, warm blankets on his body. The fireplace kept at a steady heat, not roaring, because that dries the air and makes a fever patient worse, but steady. She talked to him sometimes when he was half awake, not about anything important, just words to let him know someone was there. Because silence in a sickroom has a weight to it that she'd always felt as a child sitting beside her father, the way it could tip a person in the wrong direction if they were on the edge. His name was Everett Rourke. She found this out from a letter on the desk in the front room, opened it only enough to see the salutation. The ranch was called Blackthorn. She'd known that from the posting. What the posting hadn't mentioned, what nothing had mentioned, was that Everett Rourke was apparently here alone. There was no sign of any other person in the house. No second set of dishes in the drying rack, no extra boots. The spare bedroom at the end of the hall had a made bed that hadn't been slept in, and a layer of dust on the dressers that suggested it had been that way for some time. She found this puzzling. A ranch this size needed hands at minimum. The barn needed tending. There were animals, she could hear them. Cattle somewhere to the south, and she'd need to look in on them before dark. Where was everyone? She found part of the answer in the second drawer of the desk, a ledger, and in it the wage records going back 18 months. 4 names, all crossed out, the last one 8 months ago. Paid off or quit, she couldn't tell which, but they were gone. And beneath the ledger, a stack of papers from a bank in Helena that she did not read carefully, but could not avoid missing, because the numbers were large, and the language was the kind that meant trouble. Nora put the papers back and closed the drawer. Whatever the trouble was, it would keep. Right now the man in the bedroom was her problem, and she had enough of a problem there to occupy her entirely. She found him worse at nightfall. The fever had climbed, which she'd expected. They almost always climbed at night, but it had climbed faster than she'd liked. And he was shivering despite the heat in the room, which was the kind of shivering that doesn't mean cold. She spent the night in the chair beside his bed. She dozed in small stretches, waking each time his breathing changed. She gave him broth when he could take it. She kept the fire. She talked to him sometimes, low and steady, about nothing in particular, the walk she'd taken through the snow, the quality of the beef bones she'd found, whether the cattle she'd heard to the south were his or a neighbor's. Around 2 in the morning he said something that might have been a name. It sounded like Caleb. She didn't know who that was. By morning he was a little better, not much, but a little. His eyes stayed focused longer. He drank half a cup of broth without her having to coax every spoonful. He didn't try to get up, which showed better judgment than some sick men she'd dealt with. The cattle, he said the second morning. His voice was like gravel in a tin pan, rough and rattling. I checked them last night, she said. It had been dark and cold, and the barn had been a longer walk than she'd thought, and 2 of the horses inside had needed water, and she'd done it because there was no one else. They're fine. What's the count supposed to be? He looked at her for a moment like he was trying to decide if he trusted her. She didn't take it personally. She was a stranger after all. 43, he said, wintered on the south pasture. I counted 41. Could be too sheltering in the draw. I didn't go all the way down in the dark. Something changed in his face, not gratitude exactly. More like recalculation. Like he'd expected to find the cattle gone and was adjusting to find they weren't. Who are you, he said. I told you already. Tell me again. Nora Vance. You sent a letter to Garnet. I'm the cook you hired. When did you get here? Yesterday morning. He processed this. His eyes went to the window, where the sky was the flat white of more snow coming, and then back to her. You walked from Garnet in that storm? I did. That's 12 miles. I'm aware. He closed his eyes again, but there was something different in his face now. She thought it might be the beginning of respect. She was heating more broth when she heard the horse. One horse, she thought, moving fast. The kind of fast that meant either urgency or anger, and she'd learned from her father, who'd spent years reading the landscape and everything that moved through it, that those two things often showed up together and weren't always easy to tell apart until the rider was in front of you. She put the ladle down and wiped her hands on her apron. Stood in the kitchen doorway listening. The horse stopped outside. Boots on the porch steps quick, no hesitation. The front door opened without a knock. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Tall and broad across the shoulders, wearing a heavy coat with trail dust on it despite the cold, which meant he'd been riding hard and far. He had dark hair, and the kind of face that looked like it spent most of its time outdoors. Not weathered the way Everett's was, not the slow weathering of age, but the sharp weathering of a younger man who pushed himself. He had his hat in his hand, having taken it off at the door, and he was looking around the front room with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone bracing for bad news. His eyes landed on her. The confusion was immediate and unguarded. He hadn't expected anyone to be here. She could see him revising his expectations in real time. Where's my father, he said. No greeting, no introduction. Just that bedroom, Nora said. He's sick. He's been sick for at least 3 days from what I can tell, maybe longer. Fever. It's coming down but slowly. He's not in danger right now, but he needs to stay in bed, and he needs broth and water. And who are you? She felt a flash of irritation she kept off her face. I just told you. You told me what he has. I asked who you are. Nora Vance. Your father hired me as the cook. She looked at him steadily. And you're Caleb. That caught him. He went still for just a second, just long enough for her to see that the name mattered, or the fact that she knew it mattered. He mentioned me, Caleb said. He said the name in the night when his fever was highest. I assumed. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. He put his hat on the table and moved toward the back of the house without asking her permission, and she let him go, because it was his father and his house, and whatever complicated thing existed between those two people was not her business. Yet she heard him go into the bedroom. She heard Everett's voice, low and rough. She heard Caleb's voice, quieter than she'd expected from a man his size, saying something she couldn't make out. She went back to the broth and let them have whatever was between them in private. He came back to the kitchen 20 minutes later. He'd taken off his coat. He stood in the doorway the way men sometimes stand, when they're used to being the biggest presence in a room, and have just encountered something that's rearranged their expectations. He says, "You've been here 2 days," Caleb said. "That's right. And nobody else has been here. Not that I've seen." She kept her attention on the pot. "The last ranch hand's wages are recorded 8 months ago. I wasn't trying to pry, I was looking for anything that might tell me who I could send for." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You were looking for someone to help him?" "Yes, but there was nobody." "There was me," Nora said. And she said it plain, without making anything of it, because it was just the fact of the matter. He sat down at the kitchen table. It surprised her she hadn't taken him for the type to just sit. He seemed like a man in constant motion, but he sat, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "I should have come sooner," he said. It wasn't directed at her. It was the kind of statement a person makes to the room, or to themselves, when they're past pretending. Nora considered several responses and chose silence, because she'd found that was usually the more useful one when someone was working through something real. "How bad was he?" Caleb asked. When I got here, she thought about how to say it accurately. He was conscious, but not fully. He hadn't had water in hours, from what I could tell by the cloth beside his bed. The fire was out, the range was cold. She paused. He would have gotten worse. She didn't say what worse meant, and she didn't need to. Caleb's jaw tightened. He nodded once, short and controlled, the gesture of a man putting something away for later. "You walked 12 miles in a blizzard for a $6 a month cooking job," he said. It was almost a question. "I needed the work. And you stayed when you found him like that." There was no one else. He looked at her. Then, directly, and she met it. She was used to being assessed. That was what happened when you were a woman alone, trying to make your way in a place that mostly didn't think that was your business, and she was used to people coming to their conclusions quickly and usually incorrectly. She waited to see what conclusion he'd reach. "Do you need anything?" he said. "For him. For the house. Supplies, medicine, willow bark," she said immediately. "If you can get to town, it'll help the fever. And more honey if there is any. The crock in the pantry is nearly done." She thought quickly through the rest of her list. "The cattle in the south pasture are fine for now, but the fence on the west side of the draw needs looking at before the next storm. There's a post that's working loose. And one of the horses in the barn is favoring his right front leg. Nothing bad. Probably stone bruise, but he shouldn't be worked." Caleb stared at her. "What?" she said. "You've only been here 2 days." "I pay attention," Nora said. "Are you going to write any of this down, or should I repeat it?" He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, though it didn't quite complete itself. He reached into his coat pocket. He draped the coat over the back of the chair and pulled out a small notebook. "Willow bark," he said, and wrote it down. "Honey, west fence, loose post. Right front leg, the bay, the roan." "Right," he wrote. "Anything else?" She had 3 more things on her mental list, but she gave him the most important 2 and kept the third to herself. Partly because she wasn't sure about it yet, and partly because she'd learned from experience that men who were absorbing new information had a ceiling, and once you hit it, additional information started bouncing off instead of sticking. He rode out within the hour. She watched him from the kitchen window, already mounted and moving, and thought that whatever else Caleb Rourke was, he wasn't the kind of man who let someone else's list sit idle. She could work with that, probably. Everett was awake when she brought his midday broth, more awake than he'd been since she'd arrived, and he watched her with those dark eyes that were clearly his son's eyes in an older, harder face. "Caleb was here," he said. "He's gone to get supplies. He'll be back tonight." He came. Everett said it in a way that had several layers she couldn't quite see into. "He did, 7 years, Everett said, and then stopped. Nora set the broth on the table beside him and handed him the cup and didn't ask. If he wanted to tell her about 7 years, he would. If he didn't, that was his right. He drank the broth. She waited. "He blames me for something," Everett said finally, in the way sick people sometimes get suddenly honest when their defenses are too tired to hold. "He's not wrong, but he came. He came fast," Nora said. "He'd been riding hard, you could tell from his coat." Everett closed his eyes. But there was something in his face that hadn't been there before, some small, careful loosening, and she thought that mattered, even if she couldn't quite explain why. She did not anticipate then what the next several weeks would bring. She could not have. She was thinking about broth and firewood and a loose fence post and a man with a fever who was slowly, stubbornly deciding to recover. She was not thinking about water rights or land values or a man in a fur coat who had walked into this house and dropped papers on a sick man's chest like he was dropping trash. But that moment was coming. She could feel the shape of it, the way you can sometimes feel a change in weather before the first cloud appears, something in the quality of the air, something that makes the back of your neck go careful. Caleb came back that evening with the willow bark and the honey, and 3 other things she hadn't asked for, a half pound of good coffee, a tin of tobacco she'd never use, but that she suspected was for his father, and a look in his eyes that suggested the trip to town had given him information she didn't yet have. He sat across from her at the kitchen table after they'd gotten Everett settled for the night, and the fire was down to coals, and the coffee was on, and he put his hands around the cup she'd handed him and looked into it for a moment before he looked at her. 3 people in town asked me about Blackthorn, he said. Not how my father was doing. About the land. About whether we were selling. Nora thought about the papers in the desk drawer that she hadn't read fully and had put back carefully. What did you tell them? She said. That we weren't. He looked at her. But I don't actually know yet if that's true. He said it without self-pity. Just flatly, the way you state a problem before you found the solution. I've been gone 7 years. I don't know what shape this place is really in. I found a ledger in the desk, Nora said. I wasn't reading your father's business. I was looking for ranch hands I could contact. She met his gaze. The numbers in it didn't look good. How bad? She thought about how to calibrate her answer. I only saw a page or two, but there were letters from a bank in Helena underneath. The kind of letters that have a lot of numbers in them. Caleb nodded slowly. I'll look at them tonight. There's something else, Nora said, and she said it carefully, because she'd been thinking about this since that morning when she'd stepped out to check the cattle and walked the south boundary and noticed what she'd noticed. I don't know if it means anything. I don't know enough about ranching finances to know what it means. But your creek, the one that cuts across the south pasture, it's running. Creeks run, Caleb said, in January in Montana. In the coldest winter in 8 years, she held his gaze. It's running clear and it's running strong. My father was a trapper and a surveyor both for a time, and he taught me enough to know that a creek that doesn't freeze in January up here isn't running on snowmelt. It's running on something underneath. A spring source, maybe, something deep. He used to say. She stopped because she didn't know if Caleb Rourke was a man who wanted to hear what someone's dead trapper father used to say. Say it, Caleb said. He used to say that in the West, a man who owns the water owns everything around it too, even if he doesn't know it yet. Caleb was very still for a moment. Then he reached for his coffee and drank it and set the cup down and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Something that was past assessing and past adjusting and closer to something like interest, the real kind, the kind that doesn't have an agenda behind it. Your father sounds like he was a smart man, Caleb said. He was, Nora said. He was also stubborn and difficult and wrong about half the things he was certain about. She stood up and took her cup to the basin. But the water thing, he was right about the water. She went to check on Everett one last time before bed, and when she came back through the front room, Caleb was at the desk with the ledger and the bank letters spread in front of him, and the lamp turned up high, and his face in the lamplight was quiet and intent and telling nothing. She left him to it. Whatever this place was hiding, whatever had made a powerful man in a fur coat come to a sick man's bedroom and demand a signature, she had the feeling she was going to find out. And she had the further feeling, less comfortable but equally clear, that whatever she found was going to require more from her than cooking and keeping house. She had 17 cents, worn boots, and a dead father's notebook of surveying notes she'd carried with her for 3 years because she hadn't been able to make herself leave them behind. She climbed the stairs to the small room Everett had pointed her to on the first morning, when he'd still been coherent enough to point, and she lay down on the narrow bed in her clothes, and she thought about a creek that didn't freeze, and a man in a fur coat who'd walked in without knocking, and the way Caleb Rourke had looked when she'd told him about the water. Like a man who had just discovered that the thing he was about to lose might be worth a great deal more than he'd known. Outside, the wind picked up again, driving snow against the window. The house creaked and held. Somewhere in the night, Everett Rourke breathed easier than he had in days. And Nora Vance, who had walked through a frozen door looking for $6 a month and a warm place to sleep, lay awake in the dark and thought, there's more to this than anyone's told me yet. She was right. Caleb was still at the desk when Nora came downstairs the next morning. She could tell he hadn't slept. Not because he looked disheveled, he didn't. He was the kind of man whose face didn't give that away easily. But because the lamp was burned down to almost nothing, and the coffee pot she'd left on the back of the range was empty and cold, and he had the particular stillness of someone who has been sitting in one position for too many hours and has stopped noticing. The ledger was open in front of him. The bank letters were sorted into 2 piles. He'd found a second set of papers somewhere she hadn't seen those before, and those were spread to his left with notes in the margins in his own handwriting, small and precise. She didn't say anything. She went to the range and got the fire going and put fresh water on for coffee and sliced bread for toasting and did all of it without speaking, because he was thinking, and some men think better when nobody's asking them how they're doing. He spoke first. How much do you know about ranch debt? He said. Nora set the bread on the rack above the range, and enough to know it comes in two kinds. The kind you can work your way out of, and the kind that was designed so you can't. He looked up from the papers. Which kind did your father have? She considered lying, the reflexive social lie that deflects personal questions, and decided against it. The second kind. We lost the property when I was 16. I'm sorry, don't be. It was 15 years ago. She poured hot water through the coffee strainer. What kind does Blackthorn have? Caleb leaned back in the chair and pressed the heels of his hands briefly against his eyes, the first real sign of tiredness she'd seen from him, and then dropped his hands and looked at the papers again. I'm not sure yet, he said. That's the problem. On the surface, it looks like a ranch that's been slowly going under for 3 years. Income down, expenses, credit tightened, 2 loans taken out against the land. He tapped the ledger with one finger. But the numbers don't fit right. How do you mean? A ranch going under looks a certain way. The income drops because something's wrong, bad winter, cattle disease, market crash. Here, the income dropped without any of those things happening. The herd count stayed mostly stable. The land didn't flood. The markets were fine, I know, because I was selling cattle myself during those same 3 years, and I did well. He turned the ledger toward her. So why did Blackthorn's income drop 30% over 3 years when everything around it was stable? Nora set a cup of coffee in front of him and looked at the page he was indicating. She wasn't an accountant. She'd never claimed to be. But she'd spent enough years keeping track of every penny she'd earned, and every penny that had gone out, that she's understood what numbers looked like when they told the truth, and what they looked like when they didn't. The buyers, she said. Caleb looked up. She pointed at the column on the right side of the ledger page. The prices he was getting for cattle. Look at the year before he's getting standard market rate. Close enough. Then here, 18 months ago, the prices start dropping. Not a little. 15% below market, then 20. She traced the column down with her finger, and it's only certain buyers. See, these 3 names here, every time Blackthorn sells to them, the price is low. The other buyers are fine. Caleb pulled the ledger back and studied it. His jaw tightened. He was getting undercut, Caleb said. Specifically, someone was working the buyers. That's what it looks like to me, Nora said. But I could be wrong. I'm not a rancher. You're not wrong, he said it flatly. Not as a compliment, just as a statement. He reached for the coffee cup, drank without tasting it, still looking at the numbers. 3 buyers, all in the same county, all giving prices well below what the cattle were worth. He set the cup down. And my father is the kind of man who would have noticed that, which means someone convinced him there was a reason for it, that the market in this area was just soft, that it was temporary. Is he? Nora asked. Is he what? The kind of man who would have noticed. Caleb was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of question that had more than one answer, and he seemed to know it. He's sharp, he said finally. He was sharp. 7 years ago, he was one of the most capable ranchers in this part of Montana. But he stopped. But he's been alone out here. For 3 years, from what I can tell, running this place with a skeleton crew, and then no crew at all. And when you're alone and something starts going wrong, it's easier to believe the explanation someone gives you than to go looking for a different one. He paused. Especially if the person giving the explanation is making it sound like your fault. Nora thought about the letter she'd seen in the desk, the one with the bank's letterhead. The language of it, not just numbers, but words. Careful words that she'd only read a line of before putting it back. Words that had the shape of blame to them. Someone's been telling him the ranch was failing because of him, she said. That's what I think. She sat down across from him. Outside, the wind had dropped overnight, and the morning was that particular brittle quiet that follows a storm. The kind of quiet that's almost loud in its own way. She could hear the cattle somewhere distant, and closer the creak of the barn roof in a small gust. Who? She said. Caleb looked at her. You met him already. It took her only a second. The man who came the day I arrived, the fur coat, the eyes that looked at her and found nothing worth looking at. He was here before I got here? He's been here several times, from what my father told me this morning. Over the past 2 years. Caleb's voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone keeping anger in a container. Magnus Vale, he's a land speculator out of Billings. Buys properties in distress, usually after he's had a hand in creating the distress. He has a reputation, but it's the kind of reputation that's hard to prove because he's careful about how he works. He came in here without knocking, Nora said. When I was here, he walked into your father's bedroom and dropped papers on him. What kind of papers? A document. He told him to sign it. Said the bank would call the debt by Friday if he didn't. She looked at Caleb steadily. Your father's hand was shaking. He couldn't have held a pen. Something moved through Caleb's face that was not the controlled expression she'd seen from him up to this point. It was shorter and harder and gone in less than 2 seconds, but she saw it. He'll come back, Caleb said. I expect he will. When he does, I'll be here. What are you going to do? He picked up his coffee cup, realized it was empty, set it back down. I don't know yet, he said honestly. That's the other problem. He looked at the papers spread across the desk and then at his own hands. I have money. I've done well these past 7 years, better than most. I could pay the bank debt right now today and end that part of it. But paying the debt doesn't deal with Vale, and if Vale is behind the sabotage, which I think he is, paying the debt just slows him down. He'll find another way at the property. Because he wants the land specifically, Nora said. He wants Blackthorn specifically. Has wanted it for at least 3 years, based on when the trouble started. Caleb's eyes came back to hers. Which means there's something here worth wanting. More than a struggling ranch with a debt problem. The creek was already in her mind. It had been in her mind since the night before, when she'd said it out loud and watched Caleb go still in a way that told her he'd understood the implication, even if he hadn't known what to do with it yet. My father's notebooks, she said. I told you I brought them. The survey notes. He surveyed a lot of this part of Montana in the 1860s and 70s, before the territorial government formalized everything. Some of what he recorded was never properly entered into official records. He used to say the government moved slow and surveyors moved fast, and there were always gaps. She paused. I wanted to look at his notes about this area and compare them to whatever legal records exist for Blackthorn before I said anything for certain. But what do you know about water rights? Caleb asked. He was looking at her with that direct attention that she'd noticed was his natural mode. He didn't look at people casually. He looked at them like he was actually trying to understand something. I know senior rights matter, Nora said. First to claim, first to use. My father used to say that in a dry country, the man who got to the water first got to write the rules. Montana's had water rights disputes for 30 years, Caleb said. Territorial, then state. The senior rights on major waterways are worth significant money. Not just for the land they sit on. For the downstream access, the legal right to draw first in drought, here's the leverage they give you with neighboring properties. He picked up one of the papers from the right-hand pile and turned it so she could see it. Vale's assessment of Blackthorn's value, this was attached to the bank correspondence, puts it at $11,000. That's what he's offering. Nora looked at the number. It was a lot of money to her. She was aware, looking at it, that to Caleb Rourke, it was probably not a lot of money at all, given what she'd gathered about his circumstances. Is that a fair number, she asked? For a struggling ranch with a debt and no hands and apparently failing income? Maybe. Maybe a little low, but in the range. He put the paper down. For a property with senior water rights on a year-round creek in central Montana? He shook his head. Not even close. They looked at each other across the desk, and Nora felt the thing she'd sensed the night before come into focus. The shape of what was happening here. The deliberate architecture of it. The way someone had carefully built a situation in which a valuable property would appear worthless to everyone, except the person who already knew its true value. He's been lying to the bank, she said. He's been lying to everyone, including my father. Caleb's voice had gone very quiet, the way some men's voices go when anger gets past a certain temperature. 3 years of telling him the ranch was failing because of decisions he made, because the market was soft in this region, because he was too old and too stubborn to adapt. 3 years of driving down his confidence and his income and his ability to fight back, and all of it to get his hands on a piece of land he already knew was worth 3 or 4 times what he was offering. Nora thought about Everett in the bed down the hall, the slack fever face and the shaking hand, and the way he'd said Caleb's name in the night like a man holding on to something he wasn't sure he still had the right to hold. He nearly succeeded, she said. He would have, Caleb said, if my father had signed that paper. He looked at her. Or if you hadn't shown up. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. She got up and took the coffee cups back to the kitchen and started thinking about what needed doing, because thinking about what needed doing was how she handled moments that got too large. The thing was, knowing what Vale had done and proving it were 2 different problems. And even if they could prove it, the bank debt was still real. The credit that had been tightened was still tight. The 3 buyers who'd been underpaying for Blackthorn's cattle were still the available buyers. You couldn't run a ranch on righteous anger, and you couldn't pay a bank debt with survey notebooks. She was thinking about all of this, sorting through it the way she sorted through a pantry, taking inventory when she heard the sound of riders approaching outside. Not 1 horse this time, several. Caleb heard it too. He was already on his feet and at the window before she'd set the cups down. Vale, she said. No. His voice changed. It's Harlan Goss. He turned from the window and she saw something complicated in his face. He's a neighboring rancher. North property. Been out here 30 years. A pause. He and my father had a falling out about 2 years ago. Over a fence line, supposedly. Supposedly, Nora said. The timing fits with when Vale started working on Blackthorn. He moved toward the front room. Let me handle this. She let him handle it. She stayed in the kitchen doorway and watched through the opening as Caleb opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, and she listened to the exchange with one ear while keeping the other on the sounds from the back of the house where Everett was sleeping. Harlan Goss was maybe 60, a weathered man on a heavy horse with two hands riding behind him. He didn't get down. He looked at Caleb from the saddle with an expression that was wary, and something else underneath the wary, something that looked almost like relief, though he was working hard to keep it from showing. Heard Everett was sick, Goss said. Heard you came back. Both of those things are true, Caleb said. How bad is he? Bad enough, better than he was. He'll recover. Goss nodded. He turned his hat in his hands, working the brim, a nervous gesture that didn't fit the rest of him. We said words. Your father and I. About 18 months ago. I know, Caleb said. He said some things. I said some things. Goss stopped. Worked the hat brim some more. Looking back on it now, I think someone had been talking to us both before that conversation happened. Saying things, to me about him, to him about me. Getting us worked up, he met Caleb's eyes. We were idiots. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Who was talking? Goss didn't say the name, but his jaw moved in a way that was its own kind of answer. How many others? Caleb asked. Ridley on the east side. The Pierce brothers to the south. Probably McCallan too, though he's harder to read. Goss put his hat back on. We're not your father's enemies, Caleb. We never were. But someone spent a lot of time making us act like we were. He straightened in the saddle. I don't like being made to act like something I'm not. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. My father's going to be on his feet within the week. I'd appreciate it if word got around that Blackthorn is not a dead operation. Word's already getting around, Goss said. That's why I came. He glanced at the house, and his eyes found Nora in the kitchen doorway and moved on without making much of her. We'll talk more whenever it's up. There are things to be sorted out between the ranches that should have been sorted a long time ago. He turned his horse and rode out, his two hands following. Caleb stood on the porch watching until they were over the ridge, and then he came back inside and closed the door and stood in the front room with his hands in his pockets. Vale drove a wedge between Blackthorn and every neighboring ranch, he said. He said it slowly, like he was still fitting the pieces together. Cut off the support network, left my father isolated. He looked at Nora. That's how you run a man into the ground without ever touching him. You take away everything around him first. Nora had been thinking the same thing. She'd also been thinking, since before Goss arrived, about something else entirely, something more immediate and practical, because she was a practical woman, and she'd learned that righteous clarity was useful, but it didn't pay debts. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. The bank pressure, the sabotaged buyers, the isolated neighbors, those are the parts Vale wants you focused on. She chose her words carefully. He wants you looking at the debt and the income and the legal threat, because those things make the land look like a problem to be solved by selling. While you're looking at those things, you're not looking at what makes the land worth keeping. The water rights. I want to look at my father's notebooks tonight, she said. I know this area is in there. He worked through this valley at least twice that I remember him talking about. If there's a record of when that creek was first formally identified, when the water claim was first established. She stopped. It would tell us how senior the rights actually are, Caleb finished. He understood fast. She appreciated that. If they predate most of the other claims in the valley, then the water isn't just an asset, it's leverage, she said it plainly. You can't force Vale to stop what he's doing, but if you can prove what the land is actually worth and put that information in front of the bank, in front of the other ranchers, in front of anyone Vale has been feeding false numbers to, it changes the whole picture. Caleb looked at her for a long moment with that direct attention of his, and she held it, and there was a moment where the kitchen was very quiet, and the fire in the range popped once, and the wind outside made a sound against the window. You're not just a cook, he said. I'm an excellent cook, Nora said, somewhat firmly. Don't minimize that. The corner of his mouth moved. It almost became a smile and then decided not to, noted. She brought the notebooks out that evening after Everett had been fed and settled, and the ranch work was done. Caleb had spent the afternoon doing what should have been a week's worth of deferred maintenance, methodically and without complaint, and she'd done her own share of it alongside him, which had produced an odd kind of mutual silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The silence of two people who have found the same gear and are running in it together. The notebooks were 3 of them, her father's handwriting in pencil, the pages soft and fragile at the edges from years of handling. She set them on the kitchen table under the lamp, and Caleb sat across from her, and they went through them together, she reading the notes she knew how to read, and explaining the shorthand her father had used, he following with his knowledge of the land and the legal history of the valley. They found it in the second notebook. A survey note from 1871, describing a creek running year-round through what was then an unpatented section, her father's measurements, his bearing notations, his characteristic underlining of things he considered significant, and he had underlined, twice, in the firm decisive pencil strokes she remembered from childhood. Senior claim, continuous flow, predates formal settlement of surrounding sections. Recommend formal recording with territorial office. Did he file it? Caleb asked. Nora turned the page. And the next, I don't know, he recommended it. Whether it was actually recorded, the territorial records would be in Helena. Caleb straightened. If a claim was filed before the territory organized the water rights formally before 1882, and if continuous use can be demonstrated. He stopped. He put his hand flat on the table, fingers spread, looking at nothing in particular. Vale knows, he said. He must. He's had surveyors out here. He's done his homework. He knows exactly what this land is worth, and he spent 3 years making sure my father didn't. Caleb's voice had gone to that quiet, dangerous register again. He nearly bought a property with senior water rights on a year-round creek for $11,000. Nora did not say what she was thinking, which was he still might, because the bank pressure was real, and the timeline Vale had put in front of them the accelerating deadline. The debt called early was designed to prevent exactly this kind of discovery. The more time they had, the worse it was for Vale. Vale knew that. That was why he'd come to a sick man's bedside and put a document on his chest. She said instead, "How far is Helena? 2 days' ride. 1 if you push. Is there an attorney there you trust?" Caleb looked at her with an expression that said the question had more history in it than she knew. "There's one I've worked with before. He's careful and he's good." A pause. "He'll want to see the original notebook and cross-reference it with the territorial archive himself." Nora looked at the open page with her father's underlining and thought about what it would mean to hand this over. It was the last piece of her father she had that was worth anything practical. She'd carried it through 4 towns and 2 winters in a 12-mile blizzard because she hadn't been able to leave it behind, and she wasn't entirely sure she'd known why until this moment. "Take it," she said. Caleb looked up. "Take the notebooks to Helena. All 3 of them. Let your attorney look." She kept her voice steady. "They don't do anyone any good sitting in my bag." He looked at her for a moment. "They're your father's. They're information right now," she said. "We can make them my father's again when this is finished." He held her gaze a moment longer, and then he nodded and carefully closed the notebooks and set them aside. "I'll ride in 3 days," he said, "when I'm sure my father's stable." "He'll be stable," Nora said. It was a promise she wasn't entirely certain she could keep, but she'd gotten him this far. They were still at the table when the knock came at the front door. Late, past 9, the kind of hour when nobody knocked on a ranch door unless they had a reason. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, and Nora was half a step behind him, and they both felt it, the premonition that certain knocks carry, the ones that mean the situation has changed. It wasn't Vale. It was a young man, 19 or 20, hat in hand, with a message from the bank's local representative in Garnet. He handed it over and left without waiting for a reply, which told her something about what was in it before they opened it. Caleb read it standing in the doorway. She watched his face. When he looked up, his expression was very controlled. "The bank has accelerated the debt," he said, "the full amount. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Not the Friday Vale had threatened when Everett was barely conscious, but not much better. 6 weeks to find an attorney, establish the water rights claim, get it in front of the bank, document 3 years of deliberate sabotage, and rebuild enough of Blackthorn's reputation with buyers and neighbors that the numbers looked like something other than a failing ranch. Nora looked at the message in his hand, and then at his face, and then at the window behind him, where the night was black and cold, and the stars were out hard and bright, the way they got in deep winter, when the air was too cold to hold any moisture, and everything in the sky became sharp-edged and exact. "Then we'd better not waste the 3 days, she said. "I'm not going to Helena in 3 days, Caleb said. "I'm going tomorrow. Your father will be in better hands than mine," he said, and he looked at her when he said it, directly, without apology or decoration. Like that was simply the truth. They both knew it. She wanted to argue. She was aware that the argument would be correct and would also be wrong, because the math of the situation was clear, and sending the better caretaker to Helena and leaving the better rancher at Blackthorn was not the right allocation of what they had. "I'll need a list," she said instead, "of everything I need to watch for with his fever. Anything that means it's worse, anything that—" "You already know all of that," Caleb said. "You knew it before I got here," she did. That was the problem with arguing against things that were true. He left at first light. She stood on the porch in the cold and watched him ride out with the saddlebags that held the notebooks. And then she went back inside and banked the fire and checked on Everett and started the morning broth and thought about 6 weeks and what 6 weeks actually meant when you counted the pieces. Everett was sitting up in bed when she brought his breakfast, more upright than he'd managed since she'd arrived, and his eyes were clearer. "He left," Everett said. "Not a question, Helena," she said. "Legal business." Everett was quiet. He took the broth and drank some of it. Then he told you about the water. We figured it out together, she said. She didn't want Everett to think anything had been discussed behind his back that should have been discussed with him. The creek's been visible since I got here. My father was a surveyor. I recognized what it might mean. Everett turned the cup in his hands. I knew, he said. She stopped. About the water. I knew what I had. He looked at her steadily. I'm not a fool, whatever Vale thinks. A pause. But knowing something and being able to prove it and being able to fight for it are three different things when you're alone and 63, and the bank is sending letters and your nearest neighbors have stopped speaking to you. He looked down at the cup. I was waiting. I don't know what I was waiting for. Nora sat down in the chair beside his bed. You were waiting for someone to show up, she said. Everett looked at her. His face was still older than it should have been from the fever and the hard years. But there was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there in those first days, something that looked like the man Caleb had described, the sharp, capable man who'd built Blackthorn into something real. I think I was, he said. Well, Nora said, here we are. He almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to it from him. Here we are, he said. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the range with the second pot going, and thought about 6 weeks in Vale and the bank and an attorney in Helena she'd never met, and a creek that ran year-round in a Montana January, and she thought about what needed to happen next, because knowing what needed to happen was the only way she'd ever figured out how to move. What needed to happen next was that the neighboring ranchers Goss, Ridley, the Pierce brothers, McCallan needed to know that Blackthorn was not alone and not finished. Not in some vague general way, specifically, concretely. In a way that Vale could not quietly undo with a few private conversations. She needed to bring them here. All of them. Together. In a way that made it impossible for anyone to pretend afterward that Blackthorn was an isolated, failing operation that nobody stood behind. The idea formed fully and arrived like that, complete and somewhat audacious and with several problems she hadn't solved yet. She turned it over while the broth simmered, looking for the places where it would fail, because she always tried to break her own plans before she committed to them. She was still turning it over when she heard hoofbeats again, just one horse this time, moving at a steady walk, coming from the north. Goss's direction. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. It was one of Goss's hands, young, with a folded paper in his coat pocket. He left it on the porch rail with a rock on top of it. When nobody answered his knock immediately, she'd been in the back with Everett, and by the time she got to the door he was already riding away. She brought the paper inside and unfolded it. It was a note from Harlan Goss. Brief, no wasted words, the penmanship of a man who'd learned to write practically, rather than elegantly. It said, if there's anything Blackthorn needs while Everett's down, ask. The offer's genuine. H. Goss. Nora read it twice. Then she sat down at the desk and found paper and a pen and Caleb's inkwell, and she started to write the kind of letter she'd been composing in her head since the broth pot. She was, among other things, an excellent cook. She knew what it meant to feed people properly. She knew what happened to a group of people who sat down together around food and were well fed, and treated with respect, how it changed the quality of the conversation, how it created a different kind of obligation than any contract could. She was going to cook a dinner at Blackthorn. She was going to invite every neighboring rancher and their wives, and she was going to do it in Everett Rourke's name. And by the time that dinner was over, Magnus Vale was going to have a much harder time convincing anyone in this valley that Blackthorn was a dying operation that nobody cared about. She had 6 weeks. She had a recovering old man, an absent Caleb, a year-round creek, 3 survey notebooks in a saddlebag heading toward Helena, and 17 cents that had not been spent yet because she hadn't needed them. She had exactly enough, she thought. Just barely, and not without considerable effort, and with no guarantee of how it turned out. But she had enough to start. The letter to Harlan Goss went out the same afternoon. Caleb rode toward Helena, carried by one of Goss's own hands who'd stopped back at Blackthorn on his return trip after Nora flagged him down from the porch. She'd written 4 letters total, 1 to Goss, 1 to a man named Ridley whose property bordered Blackthorn on the east, whose name she'd found in Everett's correspondence, 1 to the Pierce brothers to the south, 1 to McCallan, whose first name she didn't know and had addressed formally as Mr. McCallan because that was the only option. She'd written them all in Everett's name, which she'd asked him about first, sitting on the edge of his bed with the paper in her hand. You want to host a dinner, Everett had said. He'd looked at her the way people sometimes look at an unexpected idea, not with opposition, but with the careful expression of someone checking whether it was real before they committed to a reaction. In 2 weeks, she said, when you're on your feet enough to sit at your own table, not a charity occasion, not a sick call, a dinner between neighbors, the kind that happened before. She stopped herself from saying before Vale got into the middle of things, before things got complicated. Everett had been quiet for a moment. He turned his head toward the window, where the light was the thin, flat white of a January afternoon. "They may not come," he said. "Goss already came," Nora said, without being asked. "He came the second day Caleb was here because he wanted to." She paused. "People who are your enemies don't do that." He looked at her, and she saw him working through it, the pride and the stubbornness, and the accumulated months of isolation, all the reasons a man in his position had built to keep himself from reaching out first. She didn't push. She'd found in the short time she'd known him that Everett Rourke didn't respond well to being pushed, that he arrived at his decisions like a river arrived at the sea in his own time, by his own path, and trying to redirect him just made him take longer. "Write them," he said finally. "Use my name," so she did. And 2 days after she sent the letters, the first response came back from Goss, a single line, the handwriting the same practical sprawl as before. "We'll be there. Bring the wife. Don't argue about what to bring. We'll bring something anyway." Ridley's reply came the following day. The Pierce brothers sent a boy with a verbal message that amounted to yes. McCollin didn't reply at all, which she decided to interpret as not a no, until she had evidence otherwise. All of this was useful and necessary and completely insufficient on its own, because none of it solved the central problem, which was time. 5 weeks and 4 days left now. The bank's acceleration letter sat on the corner of the desk like a weight she kept having to decide not to move, because moving it would mean pretending it wasn't there, and she'd learned the hard way that pretending things weren't there didn't make them stop being there. Caleb had been gone 4 days. She had no way to know how things were going in Helena. She had no way to know if the attorney had looked at the notebooks yet, or what he'd found, or whether the territorial records would confirm what her father had written. She had no way to know anything that was happening beyond the boundaries of Blackthorn, which was a situation she found genuinely difficult and was trying not to let show around Everett, who was sharp enough to read her face when she forgot to manage it. She managed her face. She cooked. She ran the ranch as well as one woman could run a ranch, meant for 4 or 5 hands, which meant she made choices about what had to be done today, and what could wait until tomorrow, and what could wait until Caleb came back, and she kept those categories very clear in her mind, and did not allow them to blur. The cattle were the daily work. 43 head, she'd verified the count. By the 3rd day, the 2 she hadn't seen in the dark were in the draw exactly where she'd guessed, a pair of older cows who'd found a wind shelter, and were disinclined to leave it. She fed and watered them, and checked the fence, and broke the ice on the water trough each morning, which was a task that required a certain specific violence with a hand axe and resulted in her arriving back at the house every morning with wet sleeves and colder hands than she'd like. The horses were easier. There were 4 of them Caleb had taken the fastest, a gray mare he called Patience, which Nora thought was an interesting name for a horse a man rode hard, and the remaining 3 were manageable. The roan's leg had improved with rest as she'd expected. Stone bruise, nothing structural. Everett got stronger faster than she'd anticipated. By the 5th day, he was out of bed for a few hours. By the 7th, he was in the kitchen in the morning, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not judgment, not approval, exactly. Something more neutral than either. Observation. "You move like someone who's used to working alone," he said one morning. She glanced at him. "Is that a criticism?" "No." He drank his coffee. "Just an observation. You don't hesitate before you do something, even something you haven't done here before. Most people in a new place check themselves. Look around, make sure they're doing it right." He paused. "You just do it." "Hesitating usually just means making the same decision, but slower," she said. "That's experience talking." "It's poverty talking," she said without bitterness, just as a fact. "When you don't have a lot of room for error, you learn to commit to your choices." Everett was quiet for a moment. She thought he might let it go, which would have been fine. Instead, he said, "Where are you from?" "Eastern Plains is originally. Little town called Mercer that isn't there anymore. It dried up after the railroad went a different way." She moved the pot to a better position on the range. After that, wherever the work was. "Family?" "Gone." She said it the way she'd learned to say it, which was plainly, and without the pause that invited sympathy, because sympathy from strangers was a thing she'd never quite figured out how to hold. "It's been a few years." Everett nodded. He understood that kind of sentence. She thought that the kind that contained a great deal and disclosed very little. He'd used some of them himself in the past week. "Caleb's mother died when he was 12, Everett said. He said it to his coffee cup, not to her directly, which told her it was something he'd chosen to say, rather than something that had slipped out. I didn't handle it well. I put everything into the ranch and told myself I was doing it for him, building something for him to have. And maybe I was, partly. But it was also easier than." Nora waited. "We didn't have the same language after she was gone," he said. "Caleb and I, we'd always talk through her somehow, and when she wasn't there, we just stopped talking. He set the cup down. 7 years is a long time to not talk. He came, though, Nora said. The same thing she'd said before. He came, Everett said. She thought about the way Caleb had stood in the front room the first day, hat in hand, bracing for whatever he was going to find. The way he'd gone into the bedroom without hesitating. The way he'd sat at the kitchen table and said simply, "I should have come sooner." Not to anyone. Just to the air. "I think he's been meaning to for a while," she said carefully. "Some things take longer to work up to than they should." Everett looked at her. "Did he say that?" No, she gave him the truth of it. But he came fast when he heard. A man who didn't care wouldn't have ridden that hard. Everett turned his cup in his hands, the gesture so similar to Caleb's that she almost said something and stopped herself. She wondered if Everett knew he did it. She wondered if Caleb knew he'd inherited it. On the 9th day, Caleb came back. She heard the horse from the kitchen. Patience had a particular rhythm she'd learned by now, a slightly uneven cadence in the front left, because the mare had a very old healed injury that didn't affect her speed, but gave her a distinctive sound. She put the lid on the pot and went to the front room and opened the door before he reached the porch. He was tired. More tired than when he'd left, the kind of tired that comes from moving fast and sleeping badly and being under pressure the whole time. He had mud on his boots and his coat, and some on his face, and his eyes when they found her were sharp and asking a question before he'd even said a word. "He's fine," she said. "Better than fine. He's been in the kitchen since day 5. She saw the tension go out of his shoulders slightly. Just slightly. "Good," he said. He came inside and she brought him coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table, which had become the place where things got decided in this house, and he put his hands around the cup and looked at her and said, "The attorney's name is Whitmore. He's seen the notebooks. He spent 2 days in the Territorial Archive." She sat down and Caleb looked at her for a moment. His expression was not triumph, it was more careful than that, more aware of how much still had to happen. But there was something in it that hadn't been there before he'd ridden to Helena. "Your father filed the claim," he said. She went still. 1,871. He filed it with the Territorial Land Office in September of that year, a formal water rights claim on the creek that crosses what is now Blackthorn's South Pasture. Senior claim, continuous natural flow, predating the formal settlement surveys by 4 years. He put the cup down. Whitmore pulled the original document. "It's there. It's recorded. It's valid." Nora sat with that for a moment. She thought about her father bent over his notebooks in the lamplight, the way he would underline things twice when he was serious about them. She thought about him filing a document with a territorial office and not thinking to mention it to his daughter, who would spend years carrying his notebooks across the state, not knowing why she couldn't leave them behind. "He never told me," she said. "It was a professional filing," Caleb said, not unkindly. "A surveyor identifying and recording a resource. He probably didn't think of it as personal." "He should have," she said, and she meant it, though she wasn't angry, couldn't quite reach angry at a dead man for doing his job well. She pressed her palms flat on the table for a moment, steadying something inside herself, and then looked up. "What does Whitmore say about what it means? Senior water rights on a year-round creek predating settlement, properly recorded and uncontested." Caleb's voice took on the careful precision of a man repeating something he'd committed to memory exactly. "Whitmore says that in central Montana right now, with the expansion going on, the irrigation questions that are coming, the cattle operations competing for water access, that claim makes Blackthorn one of the most strategically valuable pieces of land in this valley." He met her eyes. He put a number on it. "How much?" "Conservative estimate, $45,000. If water competition increases the way Whitmore thinks it will over the next decade." He said the number could be 3 times that. $45,000. The bank debt that seemed so crushing, the thing Vale had used to build his entire siege around, was less than a quarter of that number. The $11,000 Vale had offered was not even close to a quarter of it. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, because she needed somewhere to look that wasn't directly at the scope of what had just landed on the table. "Vale knew," she said. Vale definitely knew. "Whitmore found evidence of a records inquiry in Helena 18 months ago, a request to review the same territorial archive, filed under a third-party agent's name that Whitmore says is connected to Vale's operations." Caleb's voice went flat. "He found the record, confirmed the senior rights, and then came down here and spent 18 more months making sure Everett was too beaten down and isolated to figure out what he was sitting on." The anger that came up in her then was cleaner than what she'd felt when Vale had walked through the front door. That had been reactive, instinctive. This was informed, and informed anger had a different quality to it, a cooler temperature that was in some ways more dangerous. "What does Whitmore recommend?" she asked. "He's filing a formal legal challenge to the bank's acceleration. The argument is that the bank's valuation of the property, which they've been using to justify the debt pressure, is based on a materially false assessment, specifically Vale's false assessment that excluded the water rights. Caleb leaned forward. If the bank knew or should have known that the assessment was wrong, they have liability. If they didn't know, then they were deceived by Vale, and they have a different problem. Either way, Whitmore says the acceleration is legally questionable and will not survive a formal challenge. How long does the challenge take? Long enough. He said it with a caution. She recognized the caution of a man who had been given good news and was carefully not letting it run ahead of the reality. Whitmore is filing within the week. The bank will have to respond. It buys us time, and it changes the bank's relationship with Vale significantly because now they know he gave them false information, which means Vale loses his lever at the bank, Nora said. He loses it, or at minimum, it gets complicated for him in ways that weren't there before. She got up and checked the pot on the range, more to do something physical with her hands than because it needed checking. The soup was fine. She stirred it anyway. The dinner is in 5 days, she said. Caleb said nothing for a moment. She turned and he was watching her. You're still doing the dinner, he said. Not a question. Not disapproval. More like he was confirming something he'd already accounted for. It matters more now, she said. The legal challenge deals with the bank. The water rights deal with Vale's strategy. But Vale has spent 3 years working on these neighbors. He hasn't just been working the bank, he's been in this community. He knows these men. He's had conversations with them that we don't know about yet. She turned back to the range. When Whitmore's challenge goes through and word starts to get around, Vale is going to try to manage the story. He's going to tell people that Blackthorn is making legal trouble, that the Rourkes are causing problems, that the water claim is going to affect everyone else's water access. She paused. People are more likely to believe the story they already have than a new one. The dinner changes the story they have. Caleb was quiet behind her. She heard him drink his coffee. You thought all of this through, he said. I had 9 days, she said. There wasn't much else to do after the cattle were fed. She heard him set the cup down, and then she heard the quality of the silence change slightly. And she was aware, in the way she'd been occasionally and uncomfortably aware for the past 2 weeks, that Caleb Rourke was looking at her in a way she hadn't yet decided what to do about. She kept her attention on the pot. He went to see his father, and she listened to their voices from the kitchen lower than before, she thought, less careful with each other. The voices of 2 people who'd been through something together, even if they'd been in different rooms when it happened. She didn't catch the words. She didn't try to. The next 5 days she cooked like she was being paid for it, which she technically was, though she was well aware that what she was producing had outgrown the $6 a month arrangement in a way nobody had mentioned yet. She was not worried about that. She had always dealt with one problem at a time, and the financial negotiation about her own position was not the immediate problem. She made stock from the beef bones and the dried vegetables in the pantry, and the wild herbs she'd found in the outbuilding that had been a kitchen garden in warmer months. She took an inventory of everything Blackthorn had, combined it with the supplies Caleb had brought back from Garnet, and planned a table that would not be modest, but would not be extravagant either. That was the balance she needed. Modest said the ranch was struggling. Extravagant said it was showing off. She wanted the dinner to say, this is a household that knows what it's doing. Everett polished his boots for the first time since she'd arrived. She didn't comment on this. She noticed it and stored it away with the other small signs of recovery that she found quietly, unreasonably satisfying. Caleb spent the days working the ranch with a focused intensity that she suspected was partly practical, and partly a way of managing the anxiety of waiting. He fixed the west fence post and 2 others she hadn't gotten to. He cleared the snow from the barn doors properly. He rode the south pasture boundary twice and came back the second time with the particular expression of a man who had looked at something familiar and understood it differently than he had before. That creek, he said, the second evening he came back from the south pasture. She looked up from the bread she was making. It's wider than I remembered, he said, and faster. Even in January, he sat down still in his coat. I grew up on this ranch. I've ridden that pasture 1,000 times. I never looked at the creek as anything other than a creek. He looked at his hands. It's been here my whole life, and I didn't see what it was. That's how it usually works, Nora said, and she didn't mean it as comfort, just as truth. The thing that's always been there is the hardest to see. He looked at her when she said that, and she kept her eyes on the bread, working the dough, because sometimes you said something that had more weight than you'd intended, and the best response was to let it be. The night before the dinner, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room upstairs and went over the menu and the seating and the sequence of the evening in her head, looking for the places it could go wrong. There were several. McCallan still hadn't confirmed. The Pierce brothers were coming, but she didn't know them at all. The conversation would at some point get to Blackthorn's situation. She couldn't prevent that. and she hadn't decided yet how much to say, and how much to let Caleb and Everett handle. She got up at 4 in the morning and went downstairs and started the kitchen range, and began the things that needed to be started early, because work was better than lying in the dark revising. Caleb came down at 5:30 and found her elbow-deep in preparation, and did not say anything foolish about whether she needed help. Instead, he looked at what she was doing, figured out what made sense for him to take on, and started doing it without asking. He was not a natural cook, but he was capable of following a clear instruction, and he did not get in her way, which she had found was rarer than it should have been in a kitchen with two people. They worked together in the early morning quiet, and it was the same kind of working together. They'd been developing for 2 weeks the parallel efficiency of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms without making a project of it. The guests started arriving late afternoon. Goss came first. As she'd expected, he was the kind of man who was early to things he'd committed to. He had his wife with him, a tall woman named Clara who looked at Nora with direct, evaluating eyes, and then offered to help with the kitchen without any of the social preamble that usually preceded such offers. "Tell me what needs doing," Clara Goss said. Nora told her, and Clara did it, and they worked beside each other with the comfortable efficiency of women who understood that a good table didn't produce itself. The Pierce brothers came together, 2 men in their 40s, big, quiet, with the manner of people who listened more than they spoke, and therefore tended to notice things. They shook Everett's hand and said they were glad to see him up, and there was something in the way Everett received this that told her how much the isolation had cost him, because he stood a little straighter when they said it. Ridley came with his 2 older sons, the kind of family that moved as a unit, and had the easy shorthand of people who'd worked the same land together for years. McCollin came last alone, and he was different from the others, younger, maybe 40, with a watchful quality and a distance that wasn't quite unfriendly but wasn't open either. He shook hands with everyone, including Nora, which surprised her slightly. Most men didn't bother with her in that context, and he sat at the far end of the table where he could see the whole room. She noted this and moved on. The dinner was what she'd wanted it to be. Not perfect, the bread went slightly darker than she'd intended on the bottom, and one of the side dishes came out too salty, and the sequence got a bit disrupted when the Pierce brothers arrived later than expected, and she'd had to hold 3 things at temperature simultaneously. But the table was full and warm, and the food was real and plentiful, and she watched the room gradually shift over the course of the meal from the careful politeness of people who'd been estranged into something that had an older, more settled quality. Everett was the best she'd seen him. He was not effusive, that wasn't who he was, but he was present in a way that mattered, and she caught him once in a conversation with Goss that had both of them leaning in over the table with the unself-conscious body language of men who had forgotten they were supposed to be at odds. Caleb moved through the evening with a social ease she hadn't fully anticipated, though she should have. He'd built a business and a reputation over 7 years, which required exactly this kind of skill. He was good with people. Not in a false way, not the salesman's performance, but in the genuine way of someone who was actually interested in what other people thought and knew how to show it. It was during the after-dinner conversation, when the table had been cleared and coffee was being drunk, and the room had settled into the particular relaxed alertness of people who'd eaten well, that McCollin spoke for the first time at any length. "I had a visit from Magnus Vale last week," he said. The room got quieter, not dramatically. Just the slight decrease in ambient movement that happened when something real entered a conversation. Caleb looked at him steadily. "What did he want?" "He wanted to know if I'd be interested in a water access arrangement." McCollin turned his coffee cup. "He said there were questions about the water rights on some of the valley properties. He said it might be worth consolidating the access agreements before things got complicated." He looked at Caleb. He mentioned Blackthorn specifically. Said the Rourkes were thinking about selling and the buyer might want to renegotiate the downstream access. The silence after this was the kind that holds more than it shows. "The Rourkes are not selling," Caleb said. He said it the way he'd said it at the bank flat, and settled with no gap for negotiation. "I told him I'd think about it," McCollin said. He looked directly at Caleb. "I'm telling you so you know where the conversation is happening." He paused. "I don't like being used as a tool in someone else's plan without knowing that's what I am." Caleb nodded once. "I appreciate that." "The water rights," Goss said from the other end of the table. The questions Vale was raising. "Is there something to know?" Caleb glanced at Nora. She gave him nothing. It was his conversation to have, his family's land, his decision how much to say. But she held his gaze for a moment and gave him the small slight nod that said, "They're here. They came. They stayed through dinner. They told you what Vale said without being asked. They'd earned it." "There's a great deal to know," Caleb said. He settled back in his chair, and Nora watched the room settle with him. All these men, and Clara Goss, turned toward the conversation that had been underneath the evening the whole time. And I'm going to tell you all of it because you should have been told years ago and you weren't. And that's something I intend to correct, he told them. Methodically, clearly, without drama, but without minimizing. The sabotaged buyer prices, the bank correspondence, the fabricated sense of isolation and failure. Vale's trip to the territorial archives in Helena, the water rights, the legal challenge Whitmore had filed. The room was very quiet by the time he finished. The Pierce brothers exchanged a look. Ridley's older son leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Goss had a look on his face that she could only describe as the particular expression of a man realizing he had been deliberately made a fool of, which is different from accidentally being made a fool of, and considerably more galvanizing. He played us, Goss said. He played all of us, Caleb said, including my father, including the bank. The 3 buyers, Ridley said. Harmon and the 2 Shea operations. They're the ones who've been underpricing Blackthorn's cattle. Yes. Ridley's jaw moved. They tried the same thing with me 2 years ago. I told them to go to hell. He paused. I thought it was just a negotiation tactic. I didn't connect it. McCallan was quiet. He was looking at the table, and Nora watched him, thinking she could see the quality of the stillness, the way it was active rather than passive. The water access arrangement he was proposing, McCallan said finally. The one he wanted me to agree to. He looked up. If I'd signed it, it would have created a competing claim to the downstream access. It would have made Blackthorn's water rights harder to defend as exclusive. The room understood this simultaneously. She saw it move through the faces. He was working to undermine the claim before it could be formally asserted, Caleb said. Last week, McCallan said. He came to me last week, which means he knows something is happening. Caleb looked at Nora again, and this time there was something different in it, not just consultation, something more urgent. If Vale knew Whitmore had been in the territorial archives, if he'd been monitoring for exactly that kind of inquiry, the same way he'd filed his own inquiry 18 months ago, he knew the challenge was coming, which meant whatever his final move was, it was already in motion. The dinner ended an hour later, differently than it had begun. Goss and Ridley and the Pierce brothers and McCallan left with the careful, purposeful manner of men who had arrived at a conclusion and were taking it home to sit with. There were handshakes at the door that had a different quality than the ones at arrival. Clara Goss found Nora in the kitchen while the men were saying their goodnights on the porch. You planned this evening, Clara said. It was not a question. I cooked the dinner, Nora said. You planned this evening, Clara said again, with a slight emphasis that told Nora the distinction she was making was not going to stick. She looked at Nora with those direct evaluating eyes, and then she said, Harlan hasn't talked about Everett Rourke without clenching his jaw for 2 years. Was relaxed tonight. Actually relaxed. She picked up the dish she'd offered to dry and set it on the shelf in the correct place, because she'd paid attention to where things went. Whatever happens with the bank and the rest of it, this mattered. After everyone was gone and Everett had gone to bed and the kitchen was clean, Caleb came back inside from checking the barn one last time and found Nora at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular. He sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Vale knows about the challenge, she said. Yes. He's going to move soon. She turned the cold cup in her hands. Whatever he's planning to do, he's going to do it before Whitmore's filing reaches the bank. I know. Do you have any idea what it is? Caleb was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them was turned low, the kind of light that made everything look a little more serious than it was, or possibly exactly as serious as it was. He has money, he said. That's always been his primary tool. When the sabotage didn't work fast enough and the bank pressure got complicated, he'll go back to money. He looked at her. He'll make an offer, a real one this time, something that looks too good to refuse. How much? Enough to clear the debt and leave something significant over. Enough to make saying yes look like the intelligent choice. He spread his hands on the table. That's how he works. He creates the desperation first, then he offers the relief. And by the time you take the relief, you've already given him what he wanted, and you didn't even need to be desperate. You just needed the pressure to have gone on long enough. That relief felt better than fighting. Nora thought about that. She thought about 17 cents and worn boots and a 12-mile walk in a blizzard. And she thought about what it felt like when someone offered you a way out of something hard. She knew what that felt like from the inside. She knew how reasonable it could sound. You're not going to take it, she said. She said it as a statement, not a question, because she wanted to know if she was right. Caleb looked at her across the low lamp. No, he said, I'm not, even if it's a lot of money. I have money, he said. He said it not as a boast, but as a fact he was laying on the table plainly, the way you lay out the pieces of a problem you're working through. I've had money for years. It didn't make me come home. It didn't fix what was broken between me and my father. It didn't put Blackthorn back together. He looked at his hands. What What we're doing right now, what you started when you lit the range that first morning, that's fixing something. Money from Vale wouldn't fix anything. It would just end it. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't be too much or too little. Get some sleep, he said after a moment. If Vale moves in the next few days, we're going to need to be clear-headed. She nodded and stood and took her cold tea to the basin. She was at the kitchen doorway when he said her name. She turned. He was still at the table, hands around his own cup, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no good category for. Not gratitude, though it had something of that in it. Not the assessed and concluded look from the first few days. Something that was still in the process of arriving, not quite finished yet. The notebooks, he said. Your father's survey notes. He paused. Whitmore is going to need them as evidence when the formal challenge goes through. They'll be in the court record. He held her gaze. Your father's name will be in the record. As the surveyor who identified and filed the original claim. He paused. I thought you should know that. Nora stood in the doorway and held that for a moment. Thomas Vance. His name in the territorial record. The filing he'd made in 1871 that he'd never mentioned to his daughter. Now surfacing 15 years after his death as the thing that might save a ranch from a man who'd tried to steal it. Thank you, she said. It was quiet and real, and she didn't add anything to it because nothing needed adding. She went upstairs. The night was clear and very cold, the stars sharp the way they'd been the night the bank letter arrived, and from her window she could just see the south pasture, where the creek ran dark and fast through the snow, year-round, continuous, senior to every other claim in this valley by 4 years. Her father had known. He'd walked through this land with his notebooks and his careful pencil and his surveyor's eye, and he had seen exactly what was here, and he had done what he could with it. And now 15 years later, that doing was mattering in ways he could not have anticipated. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she went to bed, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had. And she had learned a long time ago that you didn't go into hard days tired if you could help it. Whatever Vale was planning, it was coming. She could feel it the same way she'd felt the change in weather the night she arrived, something in the quality of the air, something that made the back of her neck careful. She was ready. Or as ready as you could be for a man who played long games and had more resources than you, and had already proven. He had no particular conscience about how he used them, which was to say not entirely ready, but committed, and in her experience, committed counted for more than ready when things actually came to the point. Vale's letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came through the bank's local representative in Garnet, which was deliberate, using an official channel, gave it the appearance of something formal and sanctioned, something that had the institution's weight behind it. Nora recognized the tactic immediately when Caleb brought it in from the porch where the representative's boy had left it, because she'd seen it before, not with land, but with the saloon owner who'd docked her wages, who'd always delivered his worst decisions through the medium of paperwork that looked official and final, and like arguing with it, would be arguing with something larger than one man's greed. Caleb read it, standing up. She watched his face and learned nothing from it, which told her it was significant, because when the news was minor, he didn't bother managing his expression. He set it on the kitchen table and she read it while he stood at the window, looking out at the south pasture. The letter was 3 pages, written in the careful legal language that required a lawyer to produce, but was designed to be read by a man under pressure who just wanted to know the number. She read through the language to find the number, and when she found it, she read the surrounding sentences twice to make sure she understood the structure. Vale was offering to purchase Blackthorn outright for $31,000. From that sum, the bank debt would be retired in full. The remaining amount, approximately $19,000 after the debt, and Vale's stated transaction costs, would be paid directly to Everett Rourke within 30 days of signing. $19,000. More money than Everett Rourke had seen in one place in his life, probably. Enough to buy a comfortable house in a decent town and live on the interest for 20 years without working another day. Enough to make the fight the legal challenge, the water rights, the 3 years of documented sabotage look, from a certain exhausted angle, like an enormous amount of effort for an uncertain outcome, when a certain outcome was sitting right here on the kitchen table. She set the letter down. He went up, she said, significantly. Caleb turned from the window. He was at 11,000 before. He's almost tripled it. Because he knows Whitmore filed. Because he knows what the filing means, Caleb said. He's not panicking. He's recalculating. He knows the water rights are going to come out now, one way or another. He'd rather buy the land before that becomes public knowledge than fight a legal battle over it after. He came back to the table and looked at the letter without touching it. This is his best offer. He won't go higher. How do you know? Because this is already above what makes sense for him if he has to fight the water rights claim in court. Every dollar he goes up from here, the math gets worse for him. He's at the edge of his rational ceiling. Caleb looked up. He's hoping 31,000 is enough to make the decision easy. Nora thought about the number again. She was not going to pretend, even to herself, that $19,000 was not a real thing. It was an enormous thing. It would change Everett's life in ways that were concrete and immediate, and not nothing. That was the particular cruelty of the offer. It was insulting. It was almost reasonable. Almost reasonable was worse than insulting, because it required you to think rather than just react. "Where is Everett?" she said. "Barn." Caleb's voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not uncertainty, because he'd seemed certain since the moment he'd said, "I'm not going to take it," the night after the dinner. More like the weight of knowing what he was certain of, and what that certainty was going to cost. "He needs to see this." "Yes," she said, "he does." She started coffee while Caleb went to get his father, because the conversation that was coming was going to require people to be sitting down with something in their hands, and coffee was the most honest thing she could offer. She made it strong. She found the tin of ginger snaps that Clara Goss had left behind after the dinner and put them on the table, because sometimes small gestures made large conversation slightly more possible. Everett came in from the barn with cold on his coat and hay on his boots and the color in his face that he'd been building back steadily for 2 weeks. He looked better than she'd seen him, genuinely better, the kind of better that was structural rather than surface. He looked like the man Caleb had described, and not like the man she'd found half delirious under 2 quilts. He sat down. Caleb put the letter in front of him. Everett read it. He read it slower than Caleb had, and she watched his face the way she'd watched Caleb's, and she learned more from it because Everett wasn't managing his expression as deliberately. She saw the number land. She saw the thing that came through his face when it landed, not greed. She didn't think it was greed. It was something older and more complicated than greed. It was relief trying to happen and being held back by something. It was exhaustion looking at an exit, and the part of him that wasn't exhausted looking at the same exit and seeing it for what it was. He finished reading and set the letter on the table and put both hands flat beside it. "It's not a bad number," Everett said. "No," Caleb agreed. "It's not." Father and son looked at each other across the table, and Nora was very aware that this was the most important conversation that had happened in this kitchen, and that she was not the right person to be the center of it. She took her coffee cup and moved to the counter and gave them the space, staying close enough to be present if it mattered. "You could have paid the debt yourself," Everett said. "From the start." "Yes," Caleb said. "You didn't." "I didn't know enough yet." Caleb turned his cup. "When I got here, I knew you were sick and the ranch was in trouble. I didn't know how the trouble had gotten here. Paying the debt without understanding, it would have been temporary. Vale would have found another angle." "He would have," Everett said. He wasn't arguing. He was confirming. "The water rights change everything," Caleb said. "Not just the value of the land. The way the land sits in this valley. The way we sit in this valley." He leaned forward slightly. "If we sell, even at 31,000, we give Vale senior water rights on a year-round creek in central Montana. We give him the ability to control downstream access for every ranch in this area. Goss, Ridley, the Pierce brothers, McAllen eventually, if Vale develops it the way Whitmore thinks he would, every one of them is negotiating with Vale for water access, and he won't negotiate generously." "I know that," Everett said. He said it quietly, not as an objection, as something he'd already been holding. "Then you know why we can't take it." Everett was silent for a long moment. Nora heard the range settle, the small sounds of a house in cold weather. Outside, one of the horses in the barn made a sound, distant and muffled. "It's not the money," Everett said finally. He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not tempted by the money, not the way you might think." He paused. "I'm tempted by the ending of it, the simplicity. You wake up one morning and the problem is gone. There's something in that." He looked up at Caleb. "When you've been fighting something for 3 years and you're tired, and you've been alone and you thought it was your own fault." He stopped. "It wasn't your fault," Caleb said. "I know that now." Everett's voice was level. "But knowing it now doesn't entirely undo what 3 years of believing it does to a person." He looked at his son. "I'm not the man I was before Vale started. I'd like to think I'm getting back there, but I'm not all the way back. And part of me wonders if I have enough left to finish a fight instead of just—" He made a small gesture with his hand, letting go. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked at his father and Nora at the counter, thought of 7 years of silence between them, and whether it was possible to say the right thing across that much accumulated distance. "You have me," Caleb said. It came out simpler than she expected. Not a speech, not a declaration. Just that, flat and honest, the way he said everything that was true. "You're not alone in it anymore. Whatever's left to fight, we fight it together." He paused. "If you want to." Everett looked at his son for a long moment. and something moved through the older man's face that was very close to what Nora had seen in the moments, just after a fever, broke the specific quality of relief that comes when something that has been wrong for too long finally begins, incrementally, to correct. "We send Vale's answer," Everett said. "Yes," Caleb said. "No," Caleb confirmed. Everett nodded once, short and settled. "Then let's figure out what comes next." What came next, they all three understood, was Vale's response to the refusal. Caleb had laid it out the night of the dinner. Vale would not accept a simple no as a final answer, because men like Vale had not built what he'd built by accepting simple no's. He would escalate. He would find another lever. The question was which lever and how fast. They didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days after Caleb sent the refusal back through the bank's representative, a single page, Whitmore's language, formal and unambiguous. Nora was in the barn, doing the morning feed when she heard 2 horses coming in from the east. She knew from the direction that it wasn't anyone from the neighboring ranches, and she knew from the pace that it wasn't casual. She finished what she was doing in the barn and came out to find Vale on the porch. He hadn't knocked this time either. He never knocked. But this time he hadn't gone in. He was standing on the porch with his lawyer behind him and one of his men, broad and quiet, at the base of the steps. He was in the fur coat, the same one, and he had that composed and faintly bored expression that she'd come to understand was not actually boredom, but its opposite, the concentrated attention of a man watching for exactly the right moment. His eyes found her crossing the yard from the barn. "Miss Vance," he said. He knew her name now. She noted that. "Mr. Vale," she said, and kept walking until she was on the porch, which put him at an angle where he had to turn slightly to address her directly, which was entirely deliberate on her part. "I'd like to speak with Rourke," he said. "Which one?" A slight pause. "Either." He amended this. "Both, if they're available." "I'll see," she said. She went inside without inviting him in. Caleb was already in the front room. He'd heard the horses too. She'd noticed this about him, that he was attentive to sounds in a way that probably came from years of working land alone, the constant low-level monitoring of everything that moved. He was standing near the window and he'd seen Vale arrive. "He came himself," Caleb said, "with the lawyer and one other man." She kept her voice level. "He's not going to get physical. He's too careful for that. But the other man is there to make a point." "I know." Caleb moved toward the door. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She thought fast, the way she'd learned to think, practical, sequential. What do we have and what do we need? He came because the refusal surprised him. He expected the number to work. He's here to talk you into it in person because he thinks he can. She held Caleb's gaze. He's very good at this. He'll find the thing that sounds most reasonable and lead you toward it. Don't argue with him on his terms. What terms should I use? Caleb asked. He wasn't being rhetorical. He actually wanted to know. Whitmore's, she said. Every time he raises something, bring it back to what the water rights filing means legally. Don't let him make this a conversation about money or compromise. Keep it on the legal ground, where he has the least to stand on. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Come with me, he said. I'm the cook. You're the reason we know what we know, he said. Come with me, she went. Vale was still on the porch. Caleb opened the door and stepped out, and Nora came behind him and stood to his left with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and Vale's eyes moved to her, and then back to Caleb, with the slight recalibration of a man who'd planned one conversation and had just found the landscape slightly different. Caleb, Vale said. He dropped the formal address, which was intentional. First name suggested familiarity, suggested they were men of similar standing talking man to man. Vale, Caleb said, and he said only the last name, flat and without matching the warmth. Vale smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that suggested ease and confidence, and the implicit message that the person smiling had no reason to be anything other than relaxed. I wanted to come myself because I think the letter may have given the wrong impression. I'm not trying to pressure anyone. I made an offer I believe is genuinely fair. Whitmore believes differently, Caleb said, a slight shift in Vale's expression. Whitmore is an attorney who's billing by the hour. He has a professional interest in making situations complicated. He has a legal filing with the Territorial Water Records Office, Caleb said. That's a different kind of interest. Vale let the smile settle into something more conversational, less performed. He was smart enough to know when a tactic wasn't working and to change it quickly. Let's be honest with each other, he said. I know about the water rights. I've known for some time. I won't pretend otherwise. He spread his hand slightly, the gesture of a man making a concession. The question isn't whether the rights exist. The question is whether defending them in court is worth what it will cost you in time and money and uncertainty. He looked at Caleb. You're a businessman. You understand risk assessment. I do, Caleb said. Then you understand that a legal process over contested water rights in Montana Territorial Court can run 2-3 years. During that time, the bank situation remains unresolved. The ranch operations are under strain. and the outcome is never guaranteed no matter how confident your attorney sounds. He paused. My offer eliminates all of that, today, clean. It was, Nora had to acknowledge, a genuinely compelling argument, which was why Vale was the one making it and not his lawyer. His lawyer could present facts. Vale could make facts feel a certain way. The bank situation, Caleb said, is not unresolved. Whitmore's challenge is filed. The bank's own counsel is now reviewing the assessment Vale's office submitted, because it failed to disclose the water rights claim. He kept his voice entirely level. That's not an uncertain legal process. That's a bank discovering it was given materially false information and responding accordingly. Something moved through Vale's expression that was carefully controlled. The assessment was prepared in good faith based on the information available at. The assessment was prepared 18 months after your office filed a records inquiry with the Territorial Archive that confirmed the senior water rights, Caleb said. The same inquiry that Whitmore found in the archive's access logs. Silence. Real silence this time, not the social kind. Vale's lawyer made a small movement behind him that he stopped immediately. Vale looked at Caleb, then at Nora, then back at Caleb. That's a serious allegation, Vale said. His voice had lost the practiced warmth. What was underneath it was harder and less pleasant. It's a documented one, Caleb said. Vale was quiet for 5 full seconds, which in this kind of conversation was a long time. Nora watched him recalculate. She could almost see the process, the shifting of pieces, the assessment of what he'd revealed by not denying it faster. What do you want? Vale said. He said it quietly, man to man, dropping the performance almost entirely now. I want you off my family's land, Caleb said. And I want you to understand that the documentation Whitmore has compiled, the buyer price records, the bank correspondence, the access logs in the Territorial Archive, has been shared with the neighboring ranches and will be shared with the territorial authorities if this does not end. Vale looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face that she couldn't name. Not quite anger, not quite respect. Something between them that was neither warm nor cold. He was assessing, she thought, the same way he'd assessed everything from the start. He was deciding how much fight remained and whether it was worth the cost. You'd be making an enemy, Vale said. You made yourself one, Caleb said. I didn't do that. Vale turned without a further word, and his lawyer and his other man turned with him, and they went down the porch steps and mounted their horses and rode east without looking back. The sound of the hooves on the frozen ground went away slowly, the way sounds do in cold air, lingering after the source had gone. Nora let out a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. Caleb stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the direction they'd gone. His hands were loose at his sides. His face was not relaxed, that wasn't the right word, but settled. The particular settledness of a man who has done a hard thing and found it survivable. That won't be the last of it, Nora said. No, he agreed. But the next move isn't his. He turned back toward the door. It's Whitmore's inside. Everett was in the front room. He'd heard. He didn't say so, but the way he looked at Caleb when they came back in said he'd been listening from beyond the doorway, which was his right. He nodded once at his son, a nod that contained several things, and Caleb nodded back, and she thought that was probably more communication than they'd managed across a table in 7 years. She went to the kitchen to start lunch, because the world did not stop requiring practical things just because significant things had happened in it. Whitmore rode out from Helena 4 days later, which was fast. She hadn't expected him for another week. He was a smaller man than she'd pictured from Caleb's description, compact and precise, with reading spectacles that he took on and off constantly while he talked, which gave his conversation a slightly punctuated quality, emphasis landing with the spectacles. He shook Nora's hand when Caleb introduced her, without hesitation, with the direct grip of someone who'd assessed what was in front of him and found it worth the gesture. He sat at the kitchen table, of course he sat at the kitchen table, and laid out what had happened since he'd filed. The bank's response to the water rights challenge had been faster than he'd expected, which told him something. The bank had its own legal counsel, and that counsel had done its own records check, and what that check confirmed had created, in Whitmore's dry understatement, a significant concern at the bank's level regarding the nature of the assessment they'd been given by Vale's office. They don't like being deceived, Whitmore said, taking off his spectacles and polishing them with a cloth from his pocket. Banks are fundamentally conservative institutions. They accept risk as a calculated matter, but they find unauthorized risk, the kind created by someone else's deception, considerably more upsetting. What are they doing about it? Caleb asked. They've suspended the acceleration. He put the spectacles back on. The original repayment terms have been reinstated pending the outcome of the water rights verification. Nora set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. Suspended. As of 3 days ago, I received word before I rode out. He looked at her directly. The bank is also, and this is not yet official, but I have it on reasonable authority, conducting its own inquiry into the assessment practices that produced the original valuation of Blackthorn. Meaning they're investigating Vale, Caleb said. Meaning they're investigating the assessment. Who produced it, and under what circumstances, and whether the information excluded from it was excluded deliberately or through negligence. Whitmore allowed himself a very small, precise smile. The distinction matters less to Vale than the investigation itself, I suspect. Everett, who had been at the table since Whitmore arrived and had said almost nothing, spoke now. Can he stop it, he said. Vale, can he find a way to make the investigation go away? Whitmore considered this seriously, which Nora appreciated. He didn't dismiss the question or rush to reassurance. He can slow it, Whitmore said. He has connections and resources, and he's not without influence with certain people. But the access log in the Territorial Archive, the record of his inquiry, 18 months before the assessment, that's a documentary record. It doesn't respond to influence. It's either there or it isn't, and it is. He took his spectacles off again and laid them on the table. A man who proves he knew what a property was worth and then provided a valuation that deliberately excluded. That information has a problem that money and influence make worse rather than better. Because paying to make it go away is its own kind of evidence, Nora said. Whitmore looked at her. Precisely, he said. She got up to refill the coffee cups and allowed herself a private moment at the range, her back to the room, where she took in what Whitmore had said and turned it over and felt not relief. Not exactly, because there was still too much unresolved for relief, but something closer to solid ground. The feeling of footing that was actually footing and not ice. The problem was that it still wasn't over. Suspended was not resolved. An inquiry was not a verdict, and Vale was still in Montana, still had money and connections, and the residual damage he'd done to Blackthorn's reputation in the market that had nothing to do with what Whitmore was filing. She turned back around. The buyers, she said. The three who've been underpricing Blackthorn's cattle. Harmon and the Shea operations. Whitmore looked at her. When the water rights are confirmed, when this is fully resolved, Blackthorn goes back to selling cattle at market rate. But those buyers have had a relationship with Vale. She looked at Caleb. They may not want to normalize, or they may use the situation as leverage for their own terms. Caleb nodded. He'd been thinking about this, she could tell. Ridley mentioned that Harmon tried the same pricing with him 2 years ago. He refused. He looked at Whitmore. If Ridley is willing to put that in writing, that Harmon approached him with below-market offers at the same time he was doing it to Blackthorn, does that help the documentation? It establishes a pattern, Whitmore said. He put the spectacles back on, which is useful. Patterns are harder to explain as coincidence than individual incidents. I'll talk to Ridley, Caleb said. And McCallan, Nora said. Vale came to McCallan directly to try to get him to sign a water access arrangement that would have undermined the senior rights claim. McCallan told us about it himself, unsolicited, she paused. He might be willing to make a statement about that conversation. Whitmore looked at her with an expression that had more in it than what he'd started the meeting with. Has anyone offered you a position? He said. She blinked. I'm sorry. You have a methodical way of looking at what a case needs, he said. He said it without apology or decoration, the way he said everything. It's not common. She didn't know what to do with that, and she was aware of Caleb watching her from the other side of the table, with an expression he was almost managing. I'm the cook, she said, for what felt like the 4th time in recent weeks. Yes, Whitmore said. Remarkable cook, I imagine. He put his spectacles back on and picked up his pen. The next 2 weeks were the kind of weeks that require you to be several things simultaneously. Patient and urgent, busy and vigilant, confident in the direction and honest about the gaps. Caleb rode to Ridley's property and came back with a written statement. He sent a letter to the Pierce brothers about the buyer situation and got back a response that was more detailed than he'd asked for, because apparently Harmon had tried his pricing scheme on the Pierce brothers too, and they'd been annoyed about it for 2 years and were glad to have a formal reason to say so. McCallan took longer. Nora wrote him a letter herself, not in Everett's name this time but in her own, which she understood was a risk because her name meant nothing in this valley, and McCallan had no particular reason to do her a favor. She wrote it plainly. Here is what we know. Here is what Whitmore needs. Here is why it matters not just for Blackthorn, but for every ranch that draws downstream water in this valley. She did not pretend it wasn't a favor she was asking. She did not make it sound easier or safer than it was. McCallan rode to Blackthorn himself, 4 days after she sent the letter. He sat at the kitchen table. Everyone sat at the kitchen table, and he had a piece of paper with him that he'd written himself in his spare practical handwriting, documenting Vale's visit and the water access proposal and the specific language Vale had used. He slid it across the table to Caleb. You knew what he was trying to do, Nora said. When you sent it to Whitmore, Vale will know you knew. I know that, McCallan said. He might make things difficult for you. McCallan looked at her with those watchful eyes. My east pasture draws from the same creek your south pasture sits on, he said. If Vale gets the senior rights and decides to develop the water access commercially, I'm the first one he can squeeze. He paused. I'm not doing you a favor, I'm protecting myself. He looked at the paper. I just happen to also be doing you a favor at the same time. That's fine, Nora said. Both things can be true. He almost smiled. It was approximately the same distance from a smile as Caleb's attempts, which she found interesting. The documentation went to Whitmore, and Whitmore worked with it, and the days passed with the slow particular tension of a situation that is moving toward resolution, but has not arrived there yet. Nora cooked and managed the house and checked the cattle and broke ice on the water trough every morning, and let herself think in the brief hours between tasks about what resolution would actually look like, not abstractly, concretely. What happened the day after this was finished. She had not allowed herself to think too clearly about this before, because it was a luxury she couldn't afford while there was still work to do, but it was becoming harder to avoid. Her position at Blackthorn had started as cook and housekeeper at $6 a month. In the 5 weeks since she'd arrived, it had become something considerably harder to categorize. She had managed the ranch in Caleb's absence. She had organized the dinner. She had written letters on behalf of the family and sat in on legal consultations and contributed to a water rights case that would determine the ranch's future. She had done all of this because there was no one else and because it needed doing, and nobody had asked her to reconsider her role or offered to pay her differently or suggested that she was exceeding what she'd been hired for. She didn't know what any of that meant. She had several theories, but she'd learned in 23 years that her theories about what situations meant were occasionally very wrong, especially when the situations involved other people's feelings rather than just practical problems. Caleb was not a man who was easy to read. She'd gotten better at it over 5 weeks of close proximity, but better was not the same as good. She was thinking about this, not productively, just circling on a morning whenever it came into the kitchen while she was making breakfast, and sat down without his coffee cup, which was unusual enough that she noticed it immediately. She looked at him. He's going to say something, Everett said. He said it to the table, not to her, which was his way of saying something that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Who is, she said, though she knew Caleb. Everett folded his hands on the table. He's been working up to it for a week. I can tell because he gets very quiet when he's thinking about something he's not sure how to say. He paused. He gets that from his mother. Nora kept her attention on the range. What kind of something? The kind that matters, Everett said. He was quiet for a moment. I want you to know whatever you decide that this ranch has needed someone like you for a long time. Before all of this started. Before Vale. The kind of person who sees what needs doing and does it without waiting for permission. He looked up. Caleb knows that. He also knows that knowing it and being able to say it correctly are two different things. A pause. He'll be clumsy about it. Most people are, she said. Clumsy isn't the worst thing. Everett nodded slowly. No, he said, it isn't. She put breakfast on the table and called for Caleb, and the morning went as mornings went, ordinary in the way that days were becoming ordinary at Blackthorn, which itself was something she hadn't anticipated, the domestication of crisis into routine, the way the ranch was starting to feel less like a situation she'd stumbled into, and more like a place she'd been for long enough that her hands knew where things were. The news from Whitmore came the following day. Not a letter this time. Whitmore himself, riding out again from Helena, arriving at midday with his coat dusty and his expression carrying something specific that he controlled very carefully until he was inside and seated. The bank has completed its preliminary review, he said. He put his spectacles on, took them off, put them back. They have concluded that the assessment submitted to them by Vale's office was materially incomplete in a manner that they are treating as deliberate misrepresentation. Everett made a sound that was not quite a word. The foreclosure proceeding against Blackthorn has been formally withdrawn, Whitmore said. Original repayment terms are reinstated. The bank has issued a formal communication to that effect. He set a document on the table, and the evidence packet, the buyer records, the access log, the neighbor statements, has been forwarded to the Territorial Attorney General's office. The kitchen was very quiet. Vale, Caleb said. The Attorney General's office will determine what, if anything, they pursue. I won't overstate what that means. These processes are slow and uncertain, and depend on political will that I cannot predict. Whitmore was careful, she noted, not to let this become something larger than it was. But the scheme has failed. The land is secure. The water rights will be formally verified within the month. He looked around the table at all three of them. Blackthorn is not going anywhere. Caleb put his hand on the table, flat, the way he'd put it the first morning, when he'd been reading the ledger and the bank letters and absorbing how bad things were. The same gesture, the same table, entirely different weight behind it. Everett turned his head toward the window. She couldn't see his face, just the angle of it, the set of the older shoulders in his chair. Then he turned back and reached for his coffee cup and drank from it, and his hand, she noticed, was not shaking. She did not say anything. She felt she was not supposed to say anything, that this moment belonged to the two of them in a particular way that even Whitmore understood, because he was looking at his documents and giving them the room. She looked at the window. Outside, the February sky was still pale and cold, but there was something in the angle of the light that was different from January, a slight shift, barely perceptible, the way winter in Montana began to let go. Not warmer, not yet, not by much. Just the light at a different angle. Just the days a few minutes longer. The creek on the south pasture was still running. She could picture it without looking at it, the dark water against the white snow, moving fast and clear the way it had been moving since the day she arrived. Her father had walked along that creek once, with his notebook and his survey equipment and his surveyor's eye, and he had written down what he saw, and he had filed a piece of paper in a territorial office, and he had gone on to the next survey in the next valley, and eventually to his death on the eastern plains in a hard winter when Nora was 20. He had no way to know what that piece of paper would do. 15 years later, in a kitchen in a house his daughter had walked to through a blizzard for $6 a month, she thought, maybe some things work out in directions nobody planned, through paths nobody could have followed in advance, and the only way to be part of that is to do the right work in front of you and trust that work to travel further than you can see. Then she stopped being that philosophical about it, because the coffee needed refilling, and Whitmore was asking a question she'd only half caught, and the ranch still had 43 head of cattle that needed to be fed before dark. She refilled the cups. She answered the question. She did the next thing, and then the thing after that, because that was what you did, and that was what had gotten them here, and it was what would get them the rest of the way, whatever the rest of the way turned out to be. Whitmore rode back to Helena the following morning, and the house was quieter without him, in a way that was different from the quiet before he'd arrived. That earlier quiet had been the quiet of a fight, still in progress, the tense, compressed stillness of people holding themselves ready for whatever came next. This was different. This was the quiet of a thing that had ended, and Nora found it almost harder to navigate, because she'd gotten used to the other kind. She knew how to function inside urgency. She'd been functioning inside it her whole life. What she was less practiced at was the moment after, when the urgency drained out and left the ordinary behind, and you had to figure out who you were in ordinary conditions. She made breakfast. She fed the cattle. She broke the ice on the trough. The morning temperature was still hard enough that it froze overnight, though the days were running above freezing now, the slow February thaw beginning its work. She came back, inside with cold hands and wet sleeves, and stood at the range to warm up, and she thought about what the next week looked like, and the week after that, and found the thinking got blurry at the edges in ways it hadn't before. Caleb was in the barn for most of the morning. Everett sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his newspapers, and did not pretend to be reading them very carefully. He had the look of a man engaged in a private patience, the way you look when you're waiting for something you've decided not to rush. She knew because Everett had told her that Caleb had been working up to saying something. She had not let herself think about that too directly. For the same reason she hadn't let herself think about the week after next the thinking got blurry, and blurry thinking was a thing she didn't trust in herself. When Caleb came in from the barn around mid-morning, he was carrying one of the old water pails that had a split in the wooden stave she'd noticed a week ago, and mentioned once and let go, because there had been more pressing things. He set it on the work counter and looked at it, and she was fairly sure he had not come inside for the pail. "I need to go to Garnet," he said. "All right," she said. She was sorting dry goods from the pantry, making a list of what needed ordering. "I need to talk to the feed supplier and the hardware man, sort out the accounts that have been let go." "That makes sense." A pause. "I'd like you to come." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the pail. "To Garnet," he said, as if she might have missed that part. "I heard you." She studied his profile. He had the particular stillness of someone who had said the thing he was going to say and was now waiting to see how it landed, trying not to make the waiting too visible. "Why?" He turned from the pail and looked at her directly, which was more his normal mode. "Because I want to introduce you to people," he said, as something other than the cook. She set the list down on the counter. "What would you introduce me as?" He opened his mouth and then he closed it, and he did the thing she'd noticed him do when he was thinking through something he hadn't fully solved yet, the slight movement in his jaw, the very small exhale. "I don't have the right word yet," he said. "That's part of why I want to go to Garnet." She looked at him for a long moment. "Caleb, I know I'm saying this badly." "You're not saying it badly," she said. "You're not saying it yet." She kept her voice even. "Say it." He looked at her, and the controlled expression dropped a level not all the way. He wasn't built for all the way, and she didn't want him to be something he wasn't but enough. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "not as the cook, not as the person who happened to show up when everything was falling apart and kept it from going under." He paused. "I'd like you to stay as the person I build the rest of this with, if that's something you want." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, one of the cattle made a sound, distant and unhurried. Nora looked at the man in front of her. He was not a simple man. He was stubborn in ways she'd already identified, and a few she probably hadn't yet. He'd made a large mistake once 7 years of absence that he'd never fully explained, and that she suspected he didn't fully understand himself yet. He was better with animals than with words, and better with problems than with feelings, and he had a long way to go with his father that they'd started but not finished. He was not the easy version of a good man. He was the actual version, which was messier and more work, and also the only version that was real. She'd walked through a frozen door in a blizzard for $6 a month, and she'd found all of this. "I'm going to have opinions about how things are done," she said. "I've noticed," he said. "Not just in the kitchen. I've noticed that too. And I'll want to know the finances. All of them. I won't manage a household and a cattle operation I can't see the numbers on." He nodded. "That's reasonable. And I want a real wage until it's formal," she said. "I'm not staying on $6 a month." Something shifted in his face that was almost the complete smile, the one that had been almost arriving for 6 weeks. "What's your number?" "We'll negotiate," she said. "In Garnet?" He said. "In Garnet," she said. He nodded, and the almost smile finished itself for the first time, and she thought it looked like him, not polished, slightly crooked, real. She turned back to her list. "I'll be ready in 20 minutes. Behind her, she heard him pick up the water pail, and she heard the pause where he stood with it for a moment, and then he set it back down and went to get his coat. Everett did not look up from his newspaper when Caleb came through the front room with his coat, but she caught the expression at the edges of his face when she came through behind Caleb with her own coat and her good boots, the ones she'd saved for town. It was not the expression of a man surprised. It was the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment and is quietly, privately satisfied to see it arrive. She didn't acknowledge it. He didn't either. They understood each other well enough by now to know when to leave things alone. The ride to Garnet was an hour, the road firmer than it had been in January, the snow retreating from the edges, the first thin brown of exposed earth visible along the sunny sides of the rises. Nora had not been off Blackthorn's land in 6 weeks, and the change of landscape had a particular effect on her, not dramatic, just the quiet recalibration of perspective that distance gives you, the way things look different when you're not living inside them constantly. She thought about the creek as they rode, the way you think about something that has become important without your full permission. The formal water rights verification would take another few weeks, Whitmore had said, but the outcome was not in serious question. The territorial records were clear. Her father's filing was documented. The senior claim would be confirmed, and Blackthorn would become, officially and undeniably, one of the most strategically situated ranches in this part of central Montana. She wondered what Thomas Vance would have made of all of it. She had a fairly good idea. He'd been a pragmatic man, her father, not given to sentiment but attentive to consequence. He would have said that he was only doing his job when he filed that claim, and then he would have looked at the water running clear through the south pasture and nodded with the particular nod he reserved for things that were well made and lasting, whether it was a well-stretched fence line, or a correctly set bearing, or a creek that ran year-round, when every other source in the county had frozen. She'd been carrying his notebooks for 3 years because she hadn't been able to explain why she needed to. She understood now that some things you carry before you know their purpose, and the carrying is itself the act of faith, even when you can't name what you have faith in. Garnet was a small town the way most Montana towns in those years were small, a main street with enough establishments to qualify, a post office, a feed supplier, a hardware man, a dry goods store, a saloon, a livery, a handful of other operations clustered around these. It had the permanent, slightly temporary feeling of a place that wasn't sure yet whether it was going to grow or contract, which was true of most of the territory in 1886. They went to the feed supplier first because Caleb said the man had been pressured by Vale's buyers to reduce his credit line to Blackthorn and hadn't wanted to but had done it anyway, and he needed to know directly that the situation had changed. The feed supplier's name was Dunbar. He was a large, slow-moving man with honest eyes and the air of someone who had been carrying a mild guilt for approximately 8 months. When Caleb explained what had happened without overemphasis, just the facts, the way he did things, Dunbar's expression cycled through several stages and settled on something that looked like relief combined with the residue of embarrassment. "I didn't want to cut you off," Dunbar said. "I want you to know that. I got word that the Rourke operation was I was told things about the debt situation, about the cattle operation, that made it seem. You were told those things deliberately, Caleb said, not harshly. Just to close the loop. I'm not here to make trouble for you about it. I'm here to reset the account and start clean. Dunbar reset the account. He shook Caleb's hand. He shook Nora's hand when Caleb introduced her, and she saw him register the introduction and what it implied with the particular perception of a man who'd known the Rourke family for years and understood what it meant that Caleb Rourke had brought someone to meet him. The hardware man was similar, shorter conversation, same general shape. The dry goods store had a woman running it, Dunbar's sister-in-law. It turned out, who looked at Nora with the direct assessing gaze of a woman evaluating another woman in a situation with some social complexity to it, and after about 30 seconds of this assessment offered her opinion that the Rourke Ranch had needed someone to set it right for a considerable time, and she was glad to see it. Nora didn't entirely know what to do with that, so she thanked her and ordered the dry goods. They ate at the small establishment at the end of the main street that served food at midday, and it was the first time in 6 weeks that Nora had eaten a meal she hadn't cooked herself, and there was a disorienting pleasure in it, the small luxury of someone else's kitchen. What happened with Vale, she said over the meal. Do you think the territorial authorities will actually pursue it? Caleb turned his fork over. Whitmore says it depends on political will. Vale has money and he has connections, he paused. But he also has a documented records inquiry that proves he knew the property's value and then submitted a false assessment to a bank. That's not ambiguous. It's either actionable or it isn't, and if the right people look at it honestly, it is. And if they don't pursue it, then he walks away from Blackthorn without what he wanted, and with his scheme known to every rancher in this valley and the bank that he was working. Caleb looked at her. That's not nothing. Men like Vale run on reputation. They need people to believe they're smart and that they deliver. He didn't deliver this time, and everyone knows why. It was not a complete justice. She understood that. The full accounting, 3 years of Everett's confidence, 3 years of deliberate isolation, the wages of 4 ranch hands who'd left because Blackthorn looked like it was failing, the prices Blackthorn's cattle hadn't gotten, none of that would be fully recovered, no matter what the territorial attorney general decided. Some losses were like that. They happened, and you documented them, and you moved forward anyway, because there was no mechanism in the world that gave you back time. She'd made her peace with that kind of thing long before Blackthorn. It was one of the harder lessons her life had taught her early, that fairness and outcome were not the same thing, and waiting for them to align could consume you. What you could do was the next right thing. What you could do was light the range and make the broth and sit in the chair beside the bed and talk into the dark so someone knew they weren't alone. What you could do was write the letter and cook the dinner and hand over your father's notebooks because they were information now, and information was what was needed. What you could do was walk through the frozen door when it opened. I want to stop at the post office, she said when they'd finished eating. Caleb looked at her. There's a woman in Butte I used to work with, she said. She found a position at a hotel up there about 2 years ago. I wrote to her once when I first got to Garnet, but she stopped. Before I walked 12 miles through a blizzard and found your dying father and your hidden creek and your entire situation. I should let her know where I am. Where you are, Caleb said, with the particular careful emphasis of a man who knew the sentence had several layers. Where I am, she said, and looked at him steadily. They stopped at the post office. She wrote a short letter to the woman in Butte. Her name was Doris. She was Irish and funny, and had a loud laugh and had been kind to Nora during a hard stretch, and she wrote it at the small counter provided for that purpose and said, I am in a place called Garnet in central Montana, and I am working at a ranch called Blackthorn, and I think I am staying. She didn't elaborate, because Doris would read the spaces in a letter as readily as the words. She sealed it and paid for the postage from her wages, which Caleb had adjusted the week before without being asked. Not yet the negotiated number, but a significant improvement on $6, and she thought about what it meant to spend money she'd earned in a place she intended to remain in, and found it felt different from spending money earned somewhere she'd been passing through. The ride back to Blackthorn was easier than the ride to Garnet, in the way that returning somewhere is easier than arriving. You know the turn, you know how long each stretch takes. You know what the last rise looks like before the ranch comes into view. When the ranch came into view, Nora looked at it the way she'd looked at it the first time, from the ridge with the wind at her back. Same building, same proportions, same wide porch. The windows had light in them now. The barn doors had been cleared. The fence along the drive was solid. There were tracks in the mud between the house and the barn that were fresh, which meant Everett had been moving around the property, which meant he was better in a way that was becoming permanent rather than fragile. She did not think it looked forgotten anymore. It looked like a place that knew it was lived in. Everett had started dinner while they were gone. which surprised her until she remembered that he had, presumably, cooked for himself for some portion of his life and was capable of it. She'd just taken over the kitchen so completely that it was easy to forget. He'd done something with the remaining salt pork and the root vegetables in a way that was earnest, if not technically refined, and he looked at her when she came in the way a person looks when they've done something they're not certain will be evaluated charitably. She tasted it. More salt, she said, and let it go another 20 minutes. He added the salt without argument, which was a form of trust she recognized. They ate, the three of them, at the kitchen table, the way they'd been eating for weeks, and the conversation was not dramatic or significant. Dunbar's credit restoration, the hardware order, the particular state of the East Road where the thaw was making it soft, the ordinary exchange of a household at the end of a practical day. She noticed it, the ordinariness, the way it was starting to accumulate, day on day, into something that had weight. After dinner, Caleb went to check the cattle, his habit, last light, make sure everything was settled, and Everett stayed at the table with his coffee, and Nora washed the dishes, and the kitchen was quiet in the comfortable way it sometimes was, the fire in the range and the lamp on the table, and the dark coming down blue and cold outside the window. He used to be afraid of this place, Everett said. She looked at him. Caleb. When he was young, Everett turned his cup. Not the ranch itself, the weight of it, the expectation. He paused. His mother used to say he'd be a different kind of man than I was, that he'd need to go find his own shape before he could come back. I heard her say it, but I didn't listen, not the way I should have. He looked at the window. When he left, I told myself he'd failed. Left when things got hard. Walked away. A long pause. I was wrong about that. Nora kept washing. She had learned that Everett said the things he said because he needed to say them and not necessarily because he required a response. And she'd learned that was sometimes the most useful kind of conversation there was. He came back because the shape fit now, Everett said. He'd done what he needed to do out there, and he came back because he was ready. I just wish it hadn't taken. He stopped. 3 years of veil and a near-death fever, she offered. Everett looked at her, and his mouth moved in the direction of the smile that he shared with his son, the one that didn't quite commit to itself, but was real when it arrived. Yes, he said. That some things take the occasion they take, she said. She dried her hands on the cloth by the range. You can't always arrange for things to happen at the right time. Sometimes you can only arrange to be ready when they do. Everett looked at her for a moment. You sound like you've thought about that before. I've had occasion to, she said. She had thought about it. She'd thought about it in the sod house, when her father was sick and she was 16 and old enough to understand how thin the margin was. She'd thought about it after her parents were both gone, and she was 20 and alone, and working her way across a territory that did not particularly organize itself around her convenience. She'd thought about it every time she'd packed what she had, and moved on to the next town and the next position, not because she wanted to keep moving, but because standing still in the wrong place was its own kind of trap. She'd thought about it, standing on a ridge in a January blizzard, looking at a dark house with no smoke coming from the chimney, doing the arithmetic of turning around and going back against the arithmetic of going forward. She'd gone forward. That was the whole story, reduced to its simplest form. She'd gone forward because forward was the only direction that had ever produced anything worth having. Caleb came back in from the cattle check and stamped the mud from his boots on the porch and came into the kitchen, and Everett took his coffee and said goodnight and went down the hall with the careful, unhurried movement of a man who had recovered and knew it, who was not going to pretend he wasn't tired, but was also not going to be diminished by it. Caleb poured himself the last of the coffee from the pot. He stood at the range drinking it and looked at her. He's better, Caleb said. He is, she agreed. Not the same as before Vale started, but better than I think he's been in years. He looked at the hallway where Everett had gone. He talked to me today while you were making the supply list. Really talked about my mother, about things I'd given up expecting him to say. He drank. I didn't know what to do with it. Did you have to do anything with it? She said. He thought about that. No, he said, I guess not. She started putting away the clean dishes. He stayed at the range and finished his coffee, and she felt him watching her in the way she'd gotten used to feeling, that attention of his that was genuine and specific and had gotten harder to be matter-of-fact about as the weeks went on. In Garnet, he said, what you told me you wanted. The finances, the equal say the wage. I meant it, she said. I know you meant it. He set the cup down. I just want to be clear that I'm agreeing to it not because you negotiate it, but because it's correct. The way this place has run for the past 6 weeks, with both of us in it, that's how it should run. That's the only way it makes sense. He paused. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm stating the obvious. She turned to look at him. That's possibly the least romantic way anyone has ever framed a proposal, she said. He looked startled for just a second, then almost smiled. I proposed in the kitchen this morning, he said. You suggested I stay, she said. That's not quite the same. Nora. Caleb. He set the cup down and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, which was a decisive number of steps, and he was close enough now that she had to tip her chin up slightly to maintain the eye contact she was maintaining, which she did. "Will you marry me?" he said, not quite a question. More like something he was stating clearly, so there was no room for misinterpretation. "Yes," she said, also not quite an answer. More like a fact they'd both already established and were now formally acknowledging. He kissed her, briefly, a real kiss and not a polished one. The kind that happens between 2 people who are still a little uncertain, and are doing it anyway, and when he pulled back his eyes were on hers, and the expression in them was the most unguarded she'd seen from him in 6 weeks. "I'm going to be difficult to live with," he said. "I already know that," she said. "So will you," he said. "I already know that too," she said. The creek on the south pasture ran through February and into March, as it had run through every January and February before this one, as it had run since long before the Rooks came to this land, and would run long after the people currently standing in this kitchen were gone. Its senior rights were formally confirmed by the Territorial Water Office on the 14th of March, a document that Whitmore delivered in person, with his spectacles on, and a satisfaction he allowed himself to show in the careful, contained way that was his version of celebration. The document went into the desk drawer where the bank letters had been, in the place of the bank letters, which had been removed and filed elsewhere by Caleb, with a precision that she recognized as meaningful. Magnus Vale left Billings sometime in the spring. The Territorial Attorney General's inquiry produced findings. She and Caleb read the summary when Whitmore sent it that documented the false assessment and the coordinated buyer manipulation with enough specificity to constitute a serious, professional and legal rebuke, though the word criminal was not in the summary, and she thought about Whitmore's caution regarding political will and understood that this was what that caution had been predicting. Vale did not go to prison. He did lose the ability to conduct business in Montana with the kind of credibility that made his schemes possible, Whitmore said, without saying more than that Vale had moved his operations east, away from the territory, somewhere with less documentation and fewer people who knew what he'd done. It was not the full accounting. She had made her peace with that in Garnet over the midday meal. You took what you got, and you didn't let the gap between what happened and what should have happened consume the thing that was actually in front of you. Harlan Goss rode over in April with Clara and a proper spring greeting and spent the afternoon talking with Everett in the front room, while Clara helped Nora in the kitchen, which was the kind of help that was also company, and company was the kind of thing Nora was still learning to receive without the faint suspicion that it would be withdrawn. Clara was practical and funny and had opinions about cattle management that she'd been keeping to herself for years on the sensible theory that nobody had asked, and now that someone had effectively asked by letting her into the kitchen, she expressed them freely, and Nora listened and stored away the ones that were genuinely useful, which was most of them. Ridley sent word that Harmon, one of the 3 buyers who'd been underpaying Blackthorn's cattle for 3 years, had been approached by 2 other area ranchers who'd pooled their operations and were no longer dependent on Harmon's prices. It wasn't legal action. It was the market working its own rough justice, the kind that doesn't make speeches but changes things anyway. The Pierce brothers came to Blackthorn twice in the spring, both times about legitimate cattle business, and the second time one of them, the younger one, whose name was Frank, stayed for dinner and helped Caleb mend the east fence in the afternoon. And Nora watched from the kitchen window as 2 men who'd been strangers 3 months ago worked down a fence line together in the early spring light with the wordless coordination of people who'd found a working understanding. And she thought, this is what Vale didn't account for. He was very good at isolation. He knew exactly how to use distance and silence and mistrust to keep people separate. What he hadn't accounted for was what happened when the isolation broke. How fast the connections came back, and how different they were the second time, more deliberate, more conscious of their own value. McCallan came in May, which was later than the others, because that was his way. He came alone, mid-morning, and he sat at the kitchen table and talked to Caleb about water access arrangements between their properties in a direct and practical way that had nothing of Vale's version of the same conversation in it. They reached an agreement in about 40 minutes that was fair to both operations and was written down in simple language and signed by both men and witnessed by Nora and by Everett, who had been in the front room and came to the kitchen doorway because he could hear the conversation and wanted to be present for the ending of it. After McCallan left, Everett stood in the doorway for a moment with his hand on the frame. He looked at the signed paper on the table. He looked at his son. He said, "Your mother would have," and stopped. Caleb waited. "She would have liked this," Everett said. "All of it." He looked at Nora when he said the last part, a quick, direct look that acknowledged everything it acknowledged and then moved on. because that was who he was. He turned and went back to the front room. Caleb looked at Nora across the table. All of it, she said. All of it, he agreed. Nora thought about a woman she'd never met, who had raised a boy who grew up knowing that he needed to go find his own shape before he could come home, and who had said so out loud to a husband who hadn't listened the way he should have, and who was not here to see any of this. She thought about her own mother, who had sat up 3 nights beside a sick man in a sod house on the eastern plains, and had not been thanked for it in any formal way, because that was just the shape of the life. She thought about all the women who had done the work that held things together, before anyone knew the things needed holding. She thought that she had been one of those women, and would probably go on being one, and that this was neither a complaint nor a point of pride, but simply the honest description of a particular kind of person, the kind who walks toward the problem when it would be easier to walk away, who lights the range when the house is cold, who stays. The creek ran all summer. The cattle went to market in the fall at proper prices, full market rate. The first time in 3 years Blackthorn's cattle had sold for what they were worth. Caleb negotiated the contracts himself, and Nora sat across the table from the buyers. When they came to the ranch, not hidden in the kitchen, present at the table where decisions were made, because that was the arrangement they'd agreed on, and Caleb did not treat agreed arrangements as optional. It was imperfect, the life they built that year. He was difficult to live with in the specific ways he'd predicted, and she was difficult in the specific ways she'd predicted. And there were arguments about things both important and unimportant, and there were silences that needed working through, and there were days when the weight of everything that had happened in the winter pressed on people in ways that didn't always have a clean resolution. Everett had bad nights sometimes, months after the fever, when the worst of it seemed to come back on him in sleep, and she learned to hear the difference between his regular movements in the dark and the restless kind, and she got up on the restless nights and made tea and put it outside his door without knocking, and in the morning he never mentioned it, and neither did she. That was also an arrangement. Some arrangements didn't need to be spoken to be kept. She wrote to Doris in Butte in November, a longer letter than the first, and Doris wrote back in her sprawling, entertaining way and said she was glad, and that she'd known from the first letter when Nora had said, "I think I am staying," that the staying was real, because Nora had never said, "I think," in a letter, about anything she wasn't sure of, and she'd never been unsure about anything that mattered. Nora read that letter twice and then put it in the desk drawer with the water rights document and the signed agreement with McAllen and the few things that had accumulated in the desk over the year that were worth keeping. She thought about what Doris had said. She thought about the frozen door and the dark windows and the 17 cents in the worn boot with the cracked left toe. She thought about what you carry before you know its purpose and what you find when you walk through the door you weren't sure you should open, and what staying means when it's chosen rather than simply inevitable. There's a particular kind of person who shows up when things are bad and stays when things get better. Not because they have no other option, but because they've looked at the option and chosen this instead. The world generally does not know what to do with that kind of person. It calls them stubborn, or lucky, or it doesn't call them anything at all because it doesn't notice them until after. But they are the ones who hold things together while everyone else is figuring out whether the thing is worth holding. They are the ones who light the range in a cold house and sit up through the night and walk 12 miles in a blizzard for $6 a month and do not stop at the frozen door because the door is hard. They go through it. And sometimes on the other side, there is a home they never knew they were looking for. The creek ran through that November too, and the November after, clear and fast and year-round, exactly as her father had recorded it, exactly as it had always been valuable, not because anyone made it so, but because it was true. And truth is the only thing that doesn't depend on who's looking at it or what they're trying to make it be. Blackthorn stood in the winter of 1887, with its fires lit and its cattle fat and its fences sound, and the people inside it were not perfect, none of them, not even close, but they were there. They had chosen to be there, and in the long run that is most of what home has ever needed to mean.